The Pacific Ocean horizon, pale, flat, endless. 1989. On the deck of the aircraft carrier Coral Sea, it's an ordinary day. Exercises, equipment maintenance, a routine honed over the years. A sailor is working at the edge of the deck when he notices it, a reflective object above the water. Not an airplane, no navigation lights, not a helicopter, no exhaust. He grabs the camera. The shutter clicks. Another. The object remains motionless, as if observing. The sailor doesn't raise the alarm, doesn't report to command, hides the film. And only years later do these images surface in public archives. But he's not the only one. Since 1947, thousands of military personnel, pilots, and engineers have recorded anomalies over the decades. Different oceans, different bases, but the same descriptions. Today, you will hear their voices, uncensored, uninterpreted. Only declassified documents from the Black Vault. Welcome to Episode 4. On that particular day, the weather was balanced with wisps of thin clouds gracing the shoreline and a tranquil surface reflecting the sky like an expansive mirror. Aircraft from the carrier air wing were engaged in routine exercises, while deck crews busily performed maintenance tasks in the intervals between launches. Nothing out of the ordinary had been planned. It was just another day aboard a vessel where such days were typically vibrant, regimented, and predictable. According to the sailor who ultimately submitted the images to public archives, he was working near the edge of the deck when he noticed a reflective object hovering above the water. This anomaly did not resemble a typical aircraft. It lacked flashing navigation lights and showed no detectable exhaust trails. Seated at a distance from the carrier group, it was positioned far beyond the standard flight pattern of any aircraft involved in that day's operations. The sailor recounted that he quickly captured the photographs using a standard film camera he habitually carried during deployments. Not feeling compelled to notify anyone at that moment, he remained focused on his duties as drills continued and the deck thrummed with activity. Raising the camera, he was able to seize the images. The first photograph in the series reveals an object that appears to be a structured metallic form positioned above the ocean. Though the object's outline is not sharply defined from such a long distance, it seems rounded and reflective. Subsequent images maintain the object's consistent elevation relative to the horizon. None of the aircraft launched from the USS Coral Sea bore a resemblance to it. Tomcats and intruders exhibited distinctive silhouettes, while helicopters would produce visible rotor disturbances. The object featured in the photographs displayed none of these characteristics. It appeared symmetrical and smooth, devoid of wings or stabilizers extending from its body. In the written account submitted to accompany the images, the sailor recounted the occurrence in straightforward terms, indicating that he observed the object for little less than a minute. It did not maneuver or accelerate, instead remaining motionless or nearly so, as though it were merely observing the carrier group from afar. With the cacophony of catapults, jet engines, and deck machinery, it rendered any sound beyond the ship itself inaudible, eliminating any auditory cues such as a hum or vibration indicative of the object's existence. After capturing the frames, the sailor lowered the camera, but upon looking again, the object had vanished as if it had never been there at all. When these photographs emerged in public circulation years later, several analysts evaluated them in an effort to establish a definitive connection to the USS Coral Sea. The ship's deployment history confirms its presence in the Pacific during the time frame described by the sailor. The lighting and cloud formations evident in the photographs correspond with the typical sea conditions experienced along its course. Additionally, the deck rail visible in one of the images bears a resemblance to the structure of the Coral Sea's portside catwalk. While none of these elements conclusively authenticate the origin, they nonetheless provide contextual coherence to the account. What is particularly striking about the photographic sequence is the object's apparent steadiness. It does not tilt, rotate, or drift noticeably across the frames. Analysts pointed out that the horizon remained stable, suggesting that the photographer managed to hold the camera relatively steady from the moving deck of the carrier. The object maintains a constant position concerning the horizon line. No airplane captured from such a distance would retain such a symmetrical stance without discernible wings or angles. No helicopter would remain motionless without revealing rotor artifacts, especially under bright conditions. A specialist who reviewed the images for the public archive observed that the frames did not exhibit the typical signatures associated with lens reflections or internal glare. The object appears in multiple photographs, shifting in relative size slightly with different zoom levels, consistent with a tangible object at a distance. The pattern of reflection on its surface indicates it was illuminated by sunlight from the upper left, aligning with the afternoon light reported in that area. The cloud patterns behind the object persist uniformly throughout the frames, lending credence to the notion that the images were captured in rapid succession. The sailor's account reveals no mention of any reaction from the command hierarchy, as he opted not to report the sighting to his superiors at that time, a decision that was not atypical aboard aircraft carriers. Sailors concentrated on their assigned tasks. Reporting a distant object or light during active operations was seldom deemed urgent, particularly in a time when enigmatic sightings were casually disregarded aboard vessels. The photographs were retained by the sailor until his departure from the Navy. It was only many years later that he entrusted them to researchers curious about aviation anomalies. When these images entered the secured archive, a comprehensive case file was compiled. This dossier encompassed the sailor's written narrative, analytical notes from various independent reviewers, and insights from military aviation experts. Their evaluations diverged significantly. Some theorized the object could be an atmospheric phenomenon, while others argued that no known aircraft could yield the shape observed in the photos. A few suggested that the object might have been a distant aircraft seen from an unusual perspective, yet the conspicuous absence of wings, tails, or heat aberrations remained challenging to align with such interpretations. Another expert contemplated the idea of balloon debris or a weather balloon. Balloons tend to drift, rotate, or take on irregular shapes due to their material composition. However, the object captured in the Coral Sea photographs appeared symmetrical and consistent without any sagging or distortion. It did not ascend or descend throughout the series of images, maintaining an altitude inconsistent with the typical movements of balloons in the open ocean winds. The surface reflection appeared smooth, contrasting with the expected wrinkling or folding. Researchers also undertook comparisons between the Coral Sea images and other notable naval incidents, including the 1952 USS Princeton encounters and subsequent carrier group occurrences documented by pilots. Although none perfectly matched the observed shape, the overall behavior bore similarities to various naval UAP reports where entities maintained a distance from vessels without any approach or retreat. These incidents involved structured crafts noted through visual observation or radar tracking. Nevertheless, the Coral Sea sequence lacks radar data. The case rests solely on photographic evidence and one sailor's testimony. In the absence of radar confirmation, some analysts honed in on the internal coherence of the frames. The object's positioning concerning the background clouds retained mathematical consistency across the images. This pattern suggests that the object was either stationary or nearly so, rather than being a fast-moving bird or aircraft. The surface highlights showed no smearing or streaking, which would have been anticipated if the object were traveling at high speed. This consistency supports the notion that the craft, whatever its nature, hovered or maintained its position above the water. Later in his statement, the sailor clarified that he had never anticipated these images would garner scrutiny. He preserved them as a personal record of something he could not identify. When he finally submitted them for public assessment, he noted that he did so because he believed they depicted an object unfathomable in resemblance to any aircraft he encountered during his naval service. He refrained from asserting that it was extraterrestrial or a product of advanced technology. He merely indicated that he had never witnessed anything like it. Analysts revisiting the images decades later acknowledged the challenge in reaching a definitive conclusion. While the photographs visibly indicate a structured object, they do not provide enough detail to illuminate finer characteristics. They offer no adequate sense of scale beyond rough estimations based on horizon geometry. Lacking telemetry, radar, or additional witnesses, the case hinges entirely on the visual documentation and the testimony of a solitary sailor. Even so, the images have maintained their intrigue, depicting an unidentified object despite extensive comparisons to recognized aircraft and atmospheric events. The importance of the Coral Sea case lies in its understated simplicity. The photographs were not procured during a climactic situation. There was no chase, evasive maneuver, or interaction with the vessel. A sailor spotted an object, captured it through his camera, and promptly resumed his responsibilities. The images lay undisturbed until they eventually were archived for public access many years later. This case represents but a small fragment within the extensive record of naval sightings, preserved not for providing conclusive answers, but for documenting an occurrence that eluded conventional classification. The USS Coral Sea engaged in thousands of operations throughout its service until its retirement. Countless sailors who served on board remember the unremarkable days that spanned the intervals between significant events. On one such day in 1989, an object manifested, hovering silently above the Pacific, leaving naught but a collection of photographs that now reside in a public archive. There remain no records indicating its origin or intended destination. The carrier group did not pursue it. The object lingered at a distance, passive and silent, offering no clues apart from the outline captured on film. In conclusion, the sequence of photographs from the Coral Sea remains a modest yet enduring entry in the annals of naval UAP history. It presents enough clarity to provoke inquiry, but lacks sufficient resolution to provide definitive answers. The images persist as they have always been, evidence of an object stationed above the ocean, seen by a sailor unable to categorize it, reflecting the soft afternoon light against the tranquil expanse of the Pacific. Marsh lived just outside Great Falls, engaging in seasonal employment that allowed him to remain connected to the land. Not being a pilot nor an astronomer, he had nevertheless developed an intimate familiarity with the skies over Montana, a trait shared by many rural inhabitants. Stargazing, observing aircraft departing from Malmstrom Air Force Base, and watching weather patterns unfolded were woven into the fabric of daily existence. Yet, the peculiar events of that spring stood out with unusual prominence. It was during this time that Marsh began to discern bright lights appearing low on the horizon, moving in erratic patterns before vanishing from view. He casually mentioned these sightings to his neighbors, who echoed similar sentiments of unusual nocturnal activity in the sky. One evening, while preparing to secure his workshop, he noticed a fascinating cluster of lights off in the distance. The lights appeared to shift positions against the darkening backdrop, tracing arcs or brief bursts of movement. Owning a small 16mm film camera, typically reserved for family occasions, he quickly retrieved it from his house, loaded the film with haste, and made his way back outside. The lights had returned, hovering just low and slightly to the west of his property. Raising the camera, he initiated filming. The resulting footage that night would become informally recognized as the Marsh Lights film, eventually archived by the Black Vault after being secured by researchers through independent UFO investigators. While the film is brief, it captures multiple luminous objects shifting across the night sky. The patterns of their movements do not conform with those of stars or conventional aircraft. The orbs adjusted their positions concerning one another, performing small maneuvers that indicated active movement rather than mere camera shake or film errors. In a written statement made later, Marsh detailed what he had witnessed. The lights shone brighter than stars and did not remain fixed. One would drift to the left while another would take a slight circle. They were not airplanes, nor did they exhibit any blinking or dimming typical of such crafts. Marsh estimated the lights remained visible for approximately 3 minutes before disappearing behind a thin veil of cloud cover. Throughout the time he filmed, he reported hearing no sounds. The objects appeared distant, yet far from stationary. Their movements were too coordinated to suggest they were meteors or satellites. At that juncture, visibility of satellites was scarce and restricted to predictable orbits that failed to coincide with the motions observed in the film. Upon reviewing the footage the next day, Marsh was taken aback to discover it contained more detail than he had initially perceived. The lights appeared to execute sharper adjustments in the frame than he had been able to discern with just his naked eye. He shared the film with a friend experienced in photographic equipment, and together they screened the footage on a small projector. Both reached the conclusion that the lights displayed motion inconsistent with stars or aircraft. Marsh forwarded a copy to a regional UFO investigator who had been compiling reports from the state, with that copy eventually landing in public archives. Initial analyses drew comparisons between the Marsh Lights film and the more famous 1950 Great Falls footage captured by Nick Mariana. Despite differences in clarity and context, both films depict multiple luminous objects gliding across the skies of Montana in manners that defy straightforward explanations. The Mariana film documented reflective metallic objects in broad daylight, whereas the Marsh film showcased nighttime lights seemingly executing maneuvers. Nonetheless, the timing and geographical alignment of the two cases indicated a series of unusual aerial phenomena in Montana within a relatively short time frame. The Black Vault file concerning the Marsh lights contains input from several seasoned reviewers. One observer noted that the lights do not behave like stars affected by atmospheric distortion. Stars appear fixed, shimmering subtly only due to air currents, while the objects in the Marsh film exhibit positional changes within the frame. The camera remains largely stable, as illustrated by the consistent horizon line and orientation of the foreground elements, effectively ruling out camera shake as the primary cause of movement. Another reviewer pondered the likelihood of aircraft from Mistram Air Force Base being involved. In April 1952, the base operated bombers and fighter trainers, all of which possessed distinctive flight characteristics, including blinking navigation lights and defined flight paths. The objects in the Marsh film do not display blinking lights. They do not follow conventional ascent or descent patterns. Instead, they shift laterally and maintain positions for brief intervals before moving again. This causality led the reviewer to deduce that these lights did not exhibit the behaviors typical of standard flight operations for aircraft. Meteorologists consulted for the archive opined that the atmospheric conditions present that night would have been inadequate to produce ball lightning or reflections from temperature inversions. Ball lightning is a rare phenomenon, typically transient and often tied to thunderstorms, none of which were present in the region during that week. Temperature inversions can reflect city lights or distant vehicle headlights upwards, yet the area surrounding Marsh's property lacked significant population centers or thoroughfares that could explain the patterns seen in the film. One of the more comprehensive evaluations involved a frame-by-frame analysis of the 16mm footage. Reviewers meticulously mapped the position of each light concerning the camera frame. This analysis unveiled that the objects executed slight yet measurable directional adjustments. Their emissions remained deliberate, not random. At least 3 distinct objects are evident in one segment of the film, occasionally aligning before drifting apart. Their brightness remained constant, suggesting a stable source of energy or illumination pattern rather than flickering or flame-based light. Marsh himself retained an unassuming attitude toward what he had managed to record. He documented the lights in plain terms within his written observations. Their movement suggested a degree of autonomy, deviating from anything I had previously witnessed in the heavens. He accentuated that the objects did not exhibit sudden accelerations. Rather, they traversed the sky in gradual arcs or executed brief directional veers. This conduct stood in stark contrast to the patterns expected from conventional aircraft, which would typically require wider, more fluid turns at such distances. The objects manifested without wings, visible structures, or sound. They were mere points of light, yet they traveled with intention. Drawing comparisons to other incidents from 1952 heightened the intrigue surrounding his observations. The same year saw a notable surge in UFO reports throughout the United States. The radar incidents over Washington, D.C. captured public interest in July of 1952, with numerous pilots in the Midwest recounting encounters with luminous entities shadowing their flights. Montana also became a hub of activity, with several sightings reported by ground witnesses and aerial personnel alike. The film featuring the marsh lights found its place within this growing compendium of unexplained phenomena. Although it did not garner the same level of notoriety as the Marana or Washington incidents, it contributed a nocturnal perspective to the overall narrative emerging across the nation. Long after it entered the annals of public records, some analysts endeavored to devise natural explanations for the enigmatic visuals. Venus and Jupiter were dismissed due to their static positions during that month. The possibility of aircraft was ruled out, given the lack of navigation lights. Meteorological phenomena were eliminated due to the favorable atmospheric conditions that prevailed. The visibility of satellites in clusters detectable by the naked eye was also checked and found wanting. Notably, flares deployed from planes in 1952 dropped quickly and radiated a flickering light as they burned. In contrast, the marsh objects remained unwavering and pursued a horizontal flight pattern. Devoid of a conventional explanation, the marsh lights were deemed unidentified, not due to any extraordinary capabilities, but because they resisted conventional classification. They did not blaze or zip abruptly across the screen. They refrained from executing right-angle turns or suddenly disappearing. Instead, they displayed a serene, coordinated movement that failed to align with any known aircraft or natural events observable in Montana's firmament at that time. The importance of the marsh lights incident resides in its uncomplicated nature. A man capturing footage from his rural property recorded something he could not identify. The film reveals objects gliding with deliberate precision while leaving no trace beyond their luminescent signatures. There exist no radar records, no pilot reports corresponding to that precise moment, and no secondary instrument readings. However, the consistency of movement, the stability of the camera, and the lack of atmospheric distortion culminated in footage that intrigued investigators. As is the case with numerous accounts from the early 1950s, the Marsh Lights film occupies a quiet niche within historical documentation, eclipsed by more prominently cited occurrences, yet no less captivating. It mirrors a time when the Montana sky revealed something that transcended the boundaries of common understanding. Following the event, Marsh resumed his everyday routine, keeping the original film stored away, yet the lights never reappeared in any similar formation, nor did subsequent sightings replicate the configuration immortalized in his tape. Today, the film is preserved digitally, permitting researchers and the public alike to scrutinize the same lights that caught Marsh's eye during that night in April 1952. The objects flicker in and out of view, gliding gently against a darkened backdrop. Their movements elude explanation, while the expansive, tranquil prairie night provided no insight into their origin. They emerged, moved with tranquil intent, and vanished into the cloud cover, leaving behind a slender strip of 16mm film that continues to evoke inquiries decades later. On July 17, 1957, a radar visual intercept involving the RB-47 aircraft unfolded over the southern United States. The sky remained unclouded across the Central Plains as the RB-47H reconnaissance aircraft took off from Forbes Air Force Base in Kansas before dawn. The air felt warm from the summer evening, and visibility extended for hundreds of miles. Occupying the aircraft were 6 men, 3 stationed on the flight deck and 3 electronic warfare officers at their workstations in the fuselage. The crew operated one of the Air Force's most advanced intelligence platforms, outfitted with radar detection devices and electronics monitoring equipment employed for reconnaissance and training operations. Their duty that early morning involved routine calibration work, nothing out of the ordinary or classified, merely another protracted loop through the region. Upon reaching optimal altitude, the RB-47 established a steady course toward the southeast. The pilots kept vigil over the horizon, while the electronic warfare officers began to scrutinize frequencies utilized by known radar facilities. Initially, everything appeared normal. Standard radar pulses manifested on their scopes, each corresponding to a ground transmitter signal. Suddenly, Lieutenant James McClure identified an unfamiliar return. It appeared on the 30,000 MHz band, but failed to resemble the signature of any ground station. The pulse pattern was erratic, fluctuating slightly in frequency as if emanating from a mobile source. McClure observed it for several seconds before alerting the flight deck. The signal disappeared, only to reappear moments later from a different angle, then vanish again. In his subsequent report, McClure characterized the signal as excessively strong and too mobile to be of terrestrial origin. The crew acknowledged the anomaly but continued on their set course, progressing toward the Texas-Oklahoma border. A few moments later, the object manifested itself anew. Major Chase, the aircraft's commander, along with his co-pilot, discerned a bright bluish-white light off the right flank of the aircraft. It neither blinked nor strobe. It maintained a consistent luminosity and appeared to mirror the RB-47's altitude. The light exhibited no discernible structure, yet it moved in synchrony with the aircraft as though linked by an invisible tether. McClure carefully reevaluated his instruments, noting how the pulsed signal reemerged, aligning precisely with the position of the mysterious light visible beyond the cockpit. This pivotal moment represented the first convergence of electronic data and visual evidence. For the crew, it transformed the anomaly from a fleeting curiosity into a significant encounter. An unidentified aerial entity was emitting radar-like pulses, and the aircraft's sensors were effectively tracking its movements. As the RB-47 penetrated deeper into Texas airspace, the object began to move dynamically. The pilots observed it surge forward, effortlessly crossing in front of their aircraft. The light veered to the left without executing banking turns or arc patterns characteristic of conventional aircraft. Instead, it maintained a fixed position directly ahead, preserving a steady distance from the RB-47. McClure's instruments confirmed a corresponding forward motion, accentuating the surreal nature of the event. Upon contact with Duncanville Air Force Station, the crew received confirmation of a radar return that coincided with the object's location, elevating the incident to a triple source event: a visual observation, onboard electronic detection, and ground radar tracking. The RB-47 adhered to its planned trajectory, with the light leading the way, then reducing its speed to permit the aircraft to close in. In an instant, it darted to the right side, repositioning itself with astonishing agility. The electronic warfare officers meticulously analyzed the pulse shifts on their displays, as they aligned perfectly with the object's maneuvers. The crew later recounted with amazement how swiftly the object could pivot. It exhibited no signs of hesitation, gradual turns, or visible means of propulsion. Major Chase depicted the light as consistent, radiant, and deliberate in its spacing, never wandering aimlessly or drawing too close to the aircraft. Adjusting their angle for optimal observation, the crew noticed the object mirroring their slight turn, accelerating ahead as if it were aware of their adjustments. Duncanville's radar corroborated this movement nearly at once. As they neared Dallas, the object executed a sharp vertical ascent, descending rapidly before soaring back to its previous altitude. McClure's receivers captured the swift dip and climb in real time, a phenomenon verified by Duncanville's radar tracking. The clear coordination between the object's movements and the readings left little room for doubt regarding its controlled navigation, dismissing the idea that it was simply drifting or falling through the atmosphere. As the crew aimed to further close the distance, adjusting both speed and direction, the object reciprocated by accelerating, drawing ahead for a moment before slowing down, ultimately shifting to the left side of the RB-47, maintaining a steady relative position. None of the aviation technology available in 1957 could rival such seamless changes in trajectory. Even the most agile fighters required sweeping arcs and precision banking to change course. In stark contrast, the luminous object demonstrated none of these flight characteristics. Nearing the Louisiana border, the encounter entered its concluding phase, with the object shadowing the RB-47 for several minutes, comfortably maintaining its position behind the right wing, the light still unwavering and the electronic pulse consistent with its bearing. The crew surveyed this mysterious presence with a mix of disbelief and intrigue. After approximately 90 minutes of interaction, the object executed one final maneuver, advancing with remarkable speed, overtaking the aircraft, briefly descending before vanishing beyond the horizon. McClure captured one last pulse on the receiver. Duncanville radar registered a fleeting return, and then silence enveloped the communication. Upon landing, the crew meticulously documented their observations, with each member interviewed separately, their accounts aligning flawlessly. The pilots recounted details of the object's light, its movements, and the seemingly calculated pacing. The electronic warfare officers provided insights into the pulse patterns and signal strengths, noting the corresponding shifts in the object's position. Ground station operators added to the narrative with detailed radar logs that illustrated correlated movements during the sighting. No discrepancies emerged from the testimonies gathered. The Air Force's Project Blue Book investigation sought to determine whether the object could have been another aircraft, a weather balloon, or some radar anomaly. However, analysts dismissed these possibilities as insufficient. No known aircraft at that time could sustain the speeds or execute the degree of directional changes and altitude variations documented throughout the encounter. Balloons could not maintain their positions and drifted according to prevailing wind patterns, while also lacking the capacity to emit radar-like signals. Meteors and atmospheric anomalies were equally disqualified, as they do not hold relative positions with aircraft nor execute coordinated maneuvers. One investigator noted that the consistency among visual, electronic, and radar accounts forged a case that defied easy dismissal. The object's intelligence was evident in its responsiveness to the RB-47's maneuvers. It approached, retreated, paced, and performed turns that contradicted established aerodynamic principles. The absence of a definite structure during the visual observation only added complexity to the enigma, with the light remaining uniform and stable, devoid of any visible outline. Subsequent independent reviews reaffirmed the robustness of the case. Engineers analyzing the electronic logs confirmed that the pulses originated from an airborne source and not from a terrestrial transmitter. Pilots examining the flight path asserted that the object's behavior bore no resemblance to any known aircraft, whether civilian or military. The duration of the encounter, extending beyond an hour, further distinguished it from instances of fleeting glimpses or reflections. Ultimately, the RB-47 case became one of the most thoroughly examined and fervently debated incidents in United States Air Force history, garnering credibility from the professionalism of the crew, the caliber of the technology involved, and the corroboration from ground radar. The object did not exhibit erratic or frenetic actions. Rather, it traversed the sky with measured control and purposeful intent, maintaining a distance from the aircraft while showcasing capabilities far exceeding those of traditional technology. The events of that morning remain firmly imprinted in the annals of history, recorded in the testimonies and data instead of sensationalistic imagery. The RB-47 continued its assigned mission following the encounter, landing without any signs of damage or interference beyond the noted signals from the crew's observations. The object left no tangible evidence in the atmosphere, no trails of vapor nor any remnants. It manifested, interacted briefly, and departed without disclosing its essence or origins. The importance of this encounter resides in its straightforwardness and the convergence of evidence gathered. No structured aircraft came into view, no metallic silhouette emerged from the brilliant light. Yet, the entity maintained pace with the reconnaissance jet, executed rapid maneuvers, emitted electronic pulses, and was detectable on ground radar. Taken in totality, these factors have rendered the RB-47 incident a lasting and unresolved case within the files of unidentified aerial phenomena. On that July morning in 1957, the southern sky remained tranquil and clear while the RB-47H sliced through the air on its training path. The crew executed their responsibilities as they had on numerous occasions before. The object that accompanied them for 90 minutes left only questions unanswered, its passage marked by synchronized tracks across the radar screens and an unceasing pulse that the electronic warfare console recorded. As the RB-47 touched down and the sun continued its ascent over the base, the encounter integrated into the Air Force's expanding catalog of unexplained incidents. It stands as a lasting reminder of something that traversed the heavens with intelligence and intent, only to dissolve into the serene expanse beyond the horizon. Red Bluff Pursuit Case, California, United States. August 13, 1960. Red Bluff, California. As twilight descended upon the northern Sacramento Valley, the warmth of the afternoon transitioned into the cooler embrace of night. Highway patrol officers Charles Carson and Stanley Scott were on duty for the night shift, overseeing the desolate rural stretches between Red Bluff and Corning. The countryside enveloped them in tranquility, comprising wide-open fields, gentle hills, and scattered farms, interrupted only by the rare headlights gliding along the road. It was the type of evening when officers anticipated nothing more than routine traffic stops and extensive periods of silence. A little after 11 o'clock in the evening, Carson and Scott were driving east of Corning when something extraordinary caught their eye. A luminous red light appeared in the sky to the northeast, stationed low on the horizon. Initially, they presumed it might be an aircraft en route to Reading Municipal Airport, yet the light moved in a manner inconsistent with conventional flight patterns. It plummeted rapidly, halted abruptly, and subsequently drifted sideways without losing elevation. The officers decelerated the patrol vehicle, transfixed as the light expanded, becoming larger and more radiant. In his formal written account, Officer Carson recounted his first impression. It resembled a massive fiery object descending toward the ground. I thought we were witnessing a crash. The officers parked the vehicle and stepped outside. The air was still, and the rural landscape lay quiet under the canvas of stars. The red object continued its descent until it hovered soundlessly above the fields. Soon after, a second light emerged alongside it, matching the first in color and intensity. Both lights began moving in synchrony, their motions smooth and deliberate. Carson and Scott understood they were observing something other than aircraft, meteors, or anything that belonged in the known sky. As the officers observed, the objects descended closer, revealing enough detail to identify the shapes. Each light was affixed to what appeared to be a substantial oval craft. The surface exhibited a metallic or reflective quality, hard to ascertain in the darkness. A gentle glow enveloped the craft, and a long, slender beam of white light extended downward, sweeping across the ground like a searchlight. This beam moved with an extraordinary precision, illuminating patches of earth without dispersing, as standard lights usually do through dust in the night air. Carson later noted that the beam acted as if anchored and solid, moving in stark lines unlike any spotlight he had encountered. Suddenly, the objects began advancing towards the officers. The patrolmen retreated toward their car, torn between the urge to escape or continue observing. The objects approached within a short distance, estimated by Carson to be no more than 200 feet above the ground. They emitted no sound. Not the hum of engine mechanisms, not the whir of rotors, not even the rush of air displacement. They glided with a seamless, controlled presence that felt profoundly discordant in the surrounding rural quiet. Carson and Scott entered their patrol vehicle and contacted the Tehama County Sheriff's Office, reporting what they deemed a potentially perilous aerial incident. The dispatcher regarded the call with gravity. Conditions that night were clear, with no expected atmospheric disturbances. Visibility was exceptional. There were no scheduled military flights in the vicinity. The officers attempted to pursue the objects as they drifted to the northeast. The patrol car navigated through the quiet back roads as the objects traversed fields and tree lines with a steady motion. At times, the craft slowed, allowing the officers to gain ground. In other moments, they shot ahead with abrupt acceleration, effortlessly covering vast distances in seconds. Carson observed that the objects could alter direction instantaneously without banking, dipping, or executing any of the maneuvers typical of aircraft. Throughout the pursuit, the white beam incessantly swept across the landscape, gliding over barns, fields, and fences, pausing intermittently as if examining the terrain. The officers noted that the beam never reflected upwards. It simply illuminated whatever it touched and continued its path. The encounter persisted near the outskirts of Red Bluff. The objects ascended higher into the night sky before plunging down once more to a low altitude, darting overhead with astonishing rapidity. Carson and Scott found themselves pulling over multiple times, stepping out of their vehicle to get a clearer view. The eerie silence of the crafts captivated them as much as the exactness of their movements. Nothing in their actions conveyed the characteristics of conventional flying machines. They did not glide serenely or meander. Rather, they maneuvered as if driven by an internal mechanism that disregarded both the wind and the forces of inertia. As midnight approached, the officers endeavored to contact other patrol units. Numerous deputies and civilian observers spread throughout Tehama County would later recount seeing similar crimson lights twinkling in the sky that evening. One family, located northeast of Red Bluff, described witnessing two radiant objects gliding in perfect harmony above their property. A farmer situated several miles away reported a solitary, brilliant red oval hovering tantalizingly over a field before shooting upwards and vanishing into the vastness above. Back on their watch, Carson and Scott diligently continued tracking the objects as long as they remained in sight. At a certain moment, the craft ascended sharply, zigzagged horizontally across the valley, and then paused mid-air as if caught in a state of suspension. The officers watched, utterly astonished. Carson would later express that the motion was reminiscent of a hummingbird's swift change of direction, sudden yet graceful. The pursuit extended for nearly 2 hours before the objects climbed further into the early morning sky, eventually disappearing into the horizon. Upon returning to the station, Carson and Scott promptly filed an official report. Their accounts were delivered with clarity and devoid of embellishment, detailing the size, hue, velocity, and dynamics of the phenomena with careful accuracy. Both officers highlighted the unusual silence of the crafts and the distinctive nature of the white beam they had observed. Their report found its way to the Air Force. An investigation by Project Blue Book was instigated almost immediately. Investigators reached out to the officers, interviewed civilian witnesses, and scrutinized weather data. The Air Force ultimately attributed the sighting to a temperature inversion that supposedly reflected lights from the nearby city of Red Bluff or from aircraft operating in the vicinity. Carson firmly disputed that explanation, asserting that he had encountered countless inversion effects during his tenure on patrol and that this sighting bore no similarity to such optical anomalies. He emphasized the distinctive movements, shapes, and characteristics of the objects, all of which were closely observed at low altitude. Officer Scott echoed this refutation of the Air Force's interpretation, noting how the objects navigated over the terrain and adjusted altitude repeatedly. Light reflections would not possess the ability to execute such maneuvers. Civilian witnesses also voiced their rejection of the inversion theory, recounting accounts of structured crafts rather than indistinct glimmers or distant reflections. The inconsistency between the official account and the testimonials of those who witnessed the event transformed the Red Bluff encounter into one of the most scrutinized cases in the annals of Project Blue Book. In the years following, researchers have revisited this incident time and again. Weather data from that night indicated conditions that did not favor inversion effects. The extraordinary clarity of the sky and the consistency of the observations led experts to conclude that witnesses had indeed seen a bona fide aerial object rather than mere reflections. What remains most remarkable about the Red Bluff encounter is the precise control exhibited by the crafts. They hovered with meticulous accuracy, surged with abrupt bursts of speed, and changed direction with jarring suddenness. Their downward beam operated distinctly, unlike any traditional searchlight, moving almost with a mechanical awareness of the ground beneath them, all while producing no sound despite their size and proximity. In modern analyses, the case remains unresolved. The Air Force's explanation is frequently regarded as insufficient, and the credibility of the witnesses, especially the two trained highway patrol officers, has ensured that this incident retains its status as a pivotal entry in the history of unidentified aerial phenomena. Their testimonies have been strikingly consistent over the years. Carson characterized the objects as machines of some sort, while Scott underscored the intelligence implied in their movements. Ultimately, the Red Bluff pursuit stands as a singular moment when seasoned observers bore witness to something traversing the California night with purposeful silence. The crafts left no physical evidence or conclusive message behind. They appeared over expansive fields, glided smoothly across the valley, and vanished just as effortlessly as they had arrived. The patrolmen documented their report. The Air Force provided its assessment, and the case slipped into public archives, where it continues to linger, a quiet enigma encapsulated in official records, and the memories of those who observed two luminous vessels roam the landscape with hushed precision. Turning now to police reports from New Hampshire, USA, dated September 3, 1965, the tranquility of the early morning hours enveloped Exit, New Hampshire. The kind of darkness characteristic of New England settled heavily once the last shops extinguished their lights. Fields, barns, and winding roads lay beneath a shroud of stillness. At 1 a.m., Officer Eugene Bertrand conducted his patrol along the edges of town, driving slowly through stretches of farmland where only the sporadic glow from farmhouse windows pierced the night. Having been on duty long enough, Bertrand was attuned to the rhythm of night shifts, where most evenings slipped by without incident. That night began routinely until he spotted a lone woman standing on the roadside. Her car had been pulled off to the shoulder, and she waved him down with urgency. She recounted having fled her vehicle after witnessing a large object hovering in the sky behind her. Her description painted it as bright, silent, and too close for comfort, inciting a fear that it might descend upon the roadway. Bertrand reassured her, checking the surrounding area but finding nothing out of the ordinary. He escorted her back toward town, ensuring her safety before resuming his watch. Less than an hour later, Bertrand received a call from the station. A teenage boy named Norman Muscarello had darted to a nearby house, frantic and clamoring for assistance. Bertrand reversed his cruiser and made his way toward the scene. Muscarello had been strolling along Route 150 after an evening spent at Exit, aiming to catch a ride home to his family. As he ambled past an open field, he noticed bright red lights hovering ominously above the treetops. Initially, he presumed they were aircraft lights emanating from Pease Air Force Base, situated not far off, but the lights intensified, descended gradually, and glided silently toward him across the expanse of the field. Muscarello later recounted to the officers that he had thrown himself into a ditch, gripped by the fear that the unidentified object was going to fly directly overhead. The lights approached so closely that he felt certain they were tracking him. Spotting a farmhouse further down the road, he sprinted towards it and began banging on the door until the residents finally let him in, promptly contacting the police. The boy was visibly shaken, his breath coming in quick gasps, adamantly asserting that the object still lingered nearby. When Bertrand arrived at the farmhouse, he found Muscarello still in distress. The officer listened intently, observing the boy's clarity and consistency. Nothing in his account appeared exaggerated or concocted. Persuasively, Muscarello insisted on returning to the site with the officer. Bertrand acquiesced, driving him back in the direction of the field where the encounter had unfolded. The night was serene, with only the sounds of crickets and distant livestock breaking the silence. Bertrand parked the cruiser at the roadside, and together they ventured into the darkness. Muscarello pointed to the location where he had first witnessed the hovering lights. Scanning the sky, Bertrand detected nothing out of the ordinary. He chose to request backup. Officer David Hunt arrived shortly thereafter, pulling up behind the cruiser. While the two officers conversed quietly in the intimate darkness, Muscarello suddenly shouted and gestured. A cluster of brilliant red lights had materialized over the trees. They were organized in a straight line, radiating an intensity that eclipsed any aircraft lights the officers had ever observed. The lights moved in unison, rising above the tree line and gliding silently through the night sky. They then dipped downward, gradually drifting toward the field. In the formal police report, Bertrand characterized the lights as bright, red, and aligned in a straight formation, noting that they appeared to move as a singular entity. Hunt's report corroborated that description. Both officers took note of the lights pulsing in an irregular pattern, their brightness oscillating, dimming slightly, and then intensifying again. The officers stood transfixed as the lights approached, advancing with deliberate control and absolute silence. Muscarello retreated as the lights descended over the field, while Hunt advanced, directing his flashlight toward the trees. Bertrand remained stationed beside him. The object seemed to rotate slightly, the lights shifting positions yet maintaining their linear alignment. The officers would later remark that the object's movement evoked a sensation of something balancing or adjusting in the atmosphere, as if it were exercising complete control. Bertrand recorded in his statement that it moved toward them without making a sound. Hunt added that the air around them felt completely undisturbed, no wind or vibrations, only a profound absence of motion from the craft apart from the steady advance of the lights. The officers retreated toward their vehicles, keeping their gaze fixed on the object. The lights glided nearer, casting a soft red glow across sections of the field. Suddenly, the object lifted gracefully, executing a rapid ascent that cleared the tree line in mere seconds. The officers observed as it accelerated toward the southeast, rising without any discernible arc or banking. It simply ascended and glided away, as if defying gravity. Bertrand and Hunt scrambled into their cruisers, attempting to pursue it along another road where they believed the object was heading. They were unable to catch up. The lights vanished behind a ridge, leaving the night sky empty once again. When the officers returned to headquarters, they promptly filed their reports. Their handwritten statements, which remain preserved to this day, were thorough and consistent. The following morning, rumors of the incident began circulating quietly among local law enforcement. Several officers from nearby departments admitted to having observed unusual lights in the area during the preceding week. Additional residents stepped forward with similar testimonies. A farmer located to the east of town reported witnessing a bright object hovering over his field 2 nights prior. Additionally, a woman residing near the exit town line indicated that she had awakened to a reddish glow illuminating her bedroom. Upon looking outside, she had seen a large object silently gliding over her barn. Once the Air Force became aware of the police reports, investigators reached out to the exit police department to collect further statements. Project Blue Book assigned the case for evaluation. The testimony provided by the officers was deemed credible. As trained observers, they had no reason to embellish their experiences. The Air Force ultimately concluded that the sightings were likely the result of lights associated with a KC-97 refueling aircraft engaged in exercises near Pease Air Force Base. According to their assessment, lights on the refueling boom or navigation array could appear peculiar from certain perspectives. Bertrand instantly dismissed this explanation. He remarked that they regularly observe aircraft from PS and affirmed that this was not an aircraft, neither in shape, behavior, nor sound. Hunt concurred, noting that the object maneuvered far too low for an Air Force tanker and that the light configuration bore no resemblance to any aircraft they were acquainted with. Muscarello likewise maintained his account, asserting that the lights advanced silently just a few feet above the treetops, something a KC-97 was entirely incapable of executing. Local newspapers reported the incident matter-of-factly, highlighting the involvement of law enforcement. The credibility established by uniformed officers lent significant weight to the story, and the exit incident quickly ascended to become one of the most frequently referenced sightings in New England. Researchers who delved into the particulars of the case identified no discrepancies in the accounts provided by the witnesses. Each of the 3 men recounted their observations in strikingly similar terms, placing strong emphasis on key aspects such as the silence, the low altitude of the lights, the linear arrangement, and their purposeful movement. Meteorological records from that evening indicated clear skies, devoid of any atmospheric phenomena that could have caused reflections or visual distortions. The sparsely populated region was free from the kind of luminous distractions that might generate optical illusions or peculiar glows. Flight logs from the nearby Air Force Base revealed refueling activities that night, yet none corresponded to the location or altitude noted by the officers during the sighting. Conventional aircraft navigation lights typically blink in regular intervals, whereas the exit objects exhibited a steadiness that was anything but standard. They emitted a soft pulse, consistently illuminating the evening sky. The importance of this case is underscored by the reliability of the witnesses and the clarity with which they described what they had seen. Officers Bertrand and Hunt were not known for making extraordinary claims. They articulated their observations in straightforward, measured language. Meanwhile, Muscarello, though affected by fear during the experience, also provided a coherent narrative. The three witnesses had each observed the object independently before their accounts converged into a singular, cohesive description. Despite efforts to connect the object to any military operations, no compelling explanation has successfully supplanted the original testimonies. The exit case has secured its place among the most significant UFO incidents in the United States, archived meticulously in the Black Vault and frequently cited in discussions that concern credible sightings reported by law enforcement. As one gazes upon the tranquil fields surrounding exit today, the scenery remains remarkably unchanged since 1965. The roads are still narrow and shrouded in darkness after sunset. Barns and farmhouses stand isolated, dotted across expansive stretches of farmland. On that early morning in September, 3 individuals beheld a silent object traversing those very fields, adorned with bright red lights aligned with precision. It hovered momentarily, maneuvered with evident control, and then vanished into thin air. Their accounts were penned before dawn arrived, and the object never made a return, allowing the night to envelop the fields once more, leaving behind only the testimony of those who witnessed something traverse the New Hampshire sky that eludes. Explanation. The tale continues with the incident at Socorro, New Mexico, USA. On April 24, 1964, in Socorro, New Mexico, the late afternoon sun cast shadows over the desert landscape as police officer Lonnie Zamora drove east of town, responding to a call about a speeding vehicle. The air was warm, dry, and still. Surrounding Socorro was a vast expanse of sand, sparse brush, and rugged arroyos, while the radio intermittently crackled with low chatter. Zamora anticipated nothing beyond a routine traffic stop before concluding his shift. At approximately 5:45 p.m., an abrupt roar echoed throughout the desert, piercing the tranquility. It was sharp and unmistakable, unlike the distant rumbling of trucks or the muffled sounds of blasting from the nearby mine. Concurrently, he observed a vivid flash to the south, a bright bluish-orange burst suddenly ascending above the hills. Assuming it to be an overturned vehicle or perhaps an explosion, Zamora promptly abandoned the speeding call and directed his patrol car towards the source of the light. Navigating along a dirt road that meandered through low hills adorned with patches of scrub, he crested a small rise and caught sight of something remarkable in the distance, an object he could not quite categorize. It appeared to be a white oval craft resting on 2 legs. At first, he conjectured it might be a small aircraft that had met with disaster. The object lay quietly in the arroyo below, with wispy clouds of dust swirling around it. Continuing his approach, Zamora scanned the vicinity for any injured passengers. Then, he noticed 2 figures positioned near the craft. He detailed them in his report as 2 diminutive beings clad in white coveralls, standing close to the object. They seemed momentarily startled upon noticing the patrol car's approach. Zamora later documented that these figures were not children, but rather smaller than average adults, responding with quick movements as though they were alarmed or frightened. One of the figures turned to the other, displaying a sense of urgency or fear. Zamora parked his vehicle, radioed his headquarters, and stepped out to gain a clearer view. In that instant, the figures disappeared behind the object, plunging the desert back into silence. Then, an intense rising roar shattered the stillness, so powerful that Zamora felt the vibrations resonate through his chest. He instinctively ducked behind his patrol car. In his report, he noted that the noise surged rapidly in pitch and intensity. Moments later, the cacophony ceased just as suddenly as it had begun. Zamora lifted his gaze, observing the object ascend from the ground, rising languidly on a column of dust. It exhibited no wings, no windows, nor any visible means of propulsion. The shape bore a resemblance to a smooth oval capsule. As it rose, he discerned an insignia emblazoned on its side, depicting a red inverted V with 3 lines arranged below it. Zamora registered this detail distinctly in the bright afternoon light. The craft continued its ascent, tilting slightly as it accelerated horizontally. It cleared the arroyo, soared over a series of power poles, and ascended into the sky with a velocity unlike that of a helicopter or conventional aircraft. Within seconds, it vanished toward the southwest. Exercising caution, Zamora approached the site, uncertain if the figures had escaped or if the ground might still be warm. The desert air bore the acrid scent of something that had been recently heated. Evidence of scorched patches of brush and a depression in the ground marked the spot where the craft had once rested. 4 landing impressions were discernible in the earth, arranged symmetrically around a central scorched area. When backup officers arrived, Zamora guided them through his account of the events, directing them to the impressions and the charred vegetation. Sergeant Chavez was the first to reach the scene, later recalling that Zamora appeared visibly shaken, describing him as pale and clearly rattled. Chavez inspected the landing marks and attentively listened to Zamora's narrative, finding the officer's description consistent and devoid of embellishment. Within an hour, an influx of officers and local officials descended upon the site. News of the event spread rapidly, attracting representatives from both the FBI and the Air Force. On the same day, Special Agent Arthur Burns of the FBI conducted an interview with Zamora, meticulously documenting his account. Burns observed that Zamora's demeanor was frank and genuine, devoid of any signs of exaggeration or hesitance. By the following morning, following notification of the reported landing trace, personnel from Halawan Air Force Base and Kirtland Air Force Base converged at the scene for further investigation. Project Blue Book dispatched Captain Hector Quintanilla's team alongside a cadre of scientists and technicians from an array of departments. The Air Force investigators meticulously captured photographs of the impressions, scorch marks, and the surrounding vegetation. Soil samples were methodically collected and precise measurements were taken. The landing markings were found to be sharply outlined, evidencing distinct pressure from a heavy object. The brush exhibited characteristics of significant heat exposure, yet no chemical residues were discovered. Pivotal detail emerged from the precise shape of the landing impressions. They were both narrow and deep, indicative of considerable downward force applied by a heavy entity. These marks lacked the shallow or dispersed appearance that would suggest scenarios involving lighter craft such as balloon gondolas. Investigators further corroborated that no helicopter operations were occurring nearby. The closest scheduled flights involved jet aircraft, ill-suited for landing in such difficult terrain, and no planes had been detected in the vicinity during that afternoon. In a subsequent round of questioning by Blue Book investigators, Zamora reiterated his account. They sought inconsistencies and found none. Zamora continued to recount the same series of events: the roar, the flame, the figures, the rising craft, the symbol, and the landing marks, without attempting to interpret or embellish what he had witnessed. His report remained strictly factual, focusing solely on the observable. He noted that he did not know what the object was, but only what he had seen. The Air Force endeavored to align the craft with known experimental vehicles, yet found no matches. Investigators explored the avenue of a hoax or misidentification, but again, nothing aligned with their possibilities. The terrain remained isolated, devoid of footprints that could correlate to the figures he had described. There were no signs of equipment, and not a single tire track from trucks or trailers was evident in the vicinity of the scene. The scorch marks and impressions presented a reality that could not be easily fabricated. Investigators also weighed the potential for student pranks emanating from the nearby New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology. The president of the institution assured the Air Force that no experiments or demonstrations had taken place that day. Faculty members later confirmed that no individuals on campus possessed the equipment capable of creating the effects observed at the landing site. The Air Force also scrutinized the possibility of a lunar landing test vehicle or early vertical takeoff craft, concluding that none were operational in that area, nor did they produce the silent ascent and rapid departure Zamora had reported. Reports emerging the day after the incident included testimonies from a family driving near the site who observed an object gliding low across the sky around the same time Zamora encountered the craft. Their narrative described a glowing oval object moving southwest. Another witness, driving toward Socorro, recounted seeing a blue flame erupting from behind the hills immediately prior to the police encounter. While these accounts did not provide additional depth, they supported the timeline presented by Zamora. The investigation by the Air Force persisted for several weeks. Soil analyses confirmed intense heat exposure at the landing site, yet nothing indicated combustion resulting from known fuels or accelerants. The scorch marks remained dry and clean, absent of the residue typical of chemical propellants. The impressions showcased no disturbances beyond the downward pressure, suggesting that the craft did not drag, rotate, or shift during its ascent. After extensive analysis over weeks, Project Blue Book ultimately classified the Socorro case as unexplained. Internal correspondence among investigators conveyed a clear consensus. Zamora was deemed a credible witness, the physical traces were authentic, and the incident lacked any conventional explanation. Years later, Captain Quintanilla reflected on the Socorro incident as one of the most enigmatic cases Blue Book had ever faced. He acknowledged that all efforts to correlate the craft with known technologies had failed. The landing traces aligned with a heavy object settled on the ground, and the scorch marks were undeniably real. The witness was reliable. For Zamora, the incident transformed into a pivotal moment of his career. He never pursued fame for his experience. He shunned speculation, turned down sensational interviews, and consistently reiterated the same factual account. In each recounting, he underscored the same elements: the roar, the flame, the white oval, the figures, and the red insignia. He maintained a disinterest in theories or alternative interpretations. He simply conveyed what he had seen. The landing site remained visible for some time thereafter. Vegetation took several months to regenerate in the scorched areas. The impressions gradually softened under the effects of wind and erosion, but were extensively documented through photographs and diagrams. The incident transformed into one of the most thoroughly investigated UFO cases in American history. Today, the Socorro case stands as a unique instance in which a sighting is substantiated by physical evidence, numerous investigations, and the testimony of a respected police officer. The case is devoid of the ambiguity that often clouds many encounters. A craft did exist, it made a landing, it left discernible traces on the ground. It ascended silently, without visible mechanical power, disappearing into the New Mexico sky, leaving scorched brush and 4 precise impressions that investigators were unable to elucidate. In the late afternoon light of April 24, 1964, a serene desert landscape became the backdrop for one of the most persistent mysteries documented within the Project Blue Book archives. Officer Zamora had anticipated responding to what he assumed was an incident or explosion. Instead, he found himself witnessing an event marked by an ethereal ascent, an object rising seamlessly from the barren ground, traversing the undulating hills before vanishing beyond the confines of the desert ridges. The remains of this encounter linger in official records, bearing testament to a phenomenon that continues to puzzle the mind. The BOAC Strat Cruiser encounter, which unfolded over international waters in the North Atlantic on June 29 in 1954, stands as one such mystery. Soaring through the thick, damp layers of morning air, the BOAC Stratic Cruiser Canopus ascended as it began its transatlantic journey from New York to London. This sizable and reliable Boeing 377, filled with passengers, crew, and an adept flight team under the command of Captain James Howard, prepared for its flight. The weather appeared unremarkable and stable, with the sea below hiding beneath an unblemished sky of clouds. The hours ahead promised nothing more than routine flying amid the tranquil heights. Captain Howard, seasoned in navigating the broad expanse of the Atlantic, understood the rhythms of weather patterns, observed the behavior of aviation lights, and noted the movements of far-off vessels glimmering through the cloud covers. Nothing about this particular flight hinted at any unusual developments. The Strat cruiser leveled off at an altitude of approximately 19,000 feet, the engines humming in a steady, reassuring pulse, while the crew settled into their customary long-distance flying routines. Approximately 3 hours into their flight, as they glided effortlessly above the chilly waters south of Labrador, First Officer Lee Boyd caught sight of something shimmering in the distance. Initially convinced it was another aircraft, he turned to Captain Howard, who leaned forward from his command seat, scrutinizing the luminous object. Bright and steady, it held a fixed position against the far-off horizon. Howard fully expected the light to resolve into a familiar navigational cue, or perhaps a reflection in the atmosphere. However, the enigma grew as the object began to approach them directly. Captain Howard later articulated how it was neither a star nor a conventional aircraft beacon, but something with deliberate purpose, moving with intention. As it neared, the object became increasingly defined, accompanied by several smaller lights flitting about it in a loose array, maneuvering in a cohesion reminiscent of conscious design. The sight bewildered the crew. No aircraft operated in such formations without illuminating navigational signals, and it was particularly rare for any assemblage to near commercial air traffic at such a uniform altitude without communication on the radio frequencies. Captain Howard instructed First Officer Boyd to maintain visual contact while he intently monitored their instruments. The Strat cruiser pushed steadily along its course, but the mysterious formation continued to close the gap, instilling a sense of wonder mixed with apprehension among the crew. Their movements exhibited no characteristics typical of meteorites or mere reflections. The formation maintained a steady grouping, adjusting both speed and position as if executing a methodical plan. Leaning closer to the cockpit windows, the crew witnessed the spectacle unfold through the crystalline cold of the glass. According to Howard's later report, the primary object appeared metallic with sharp contours. Its form was oddly elongated, resembling either a flattened sphere or disk, glimmering with a reflective surface. As the smaller orbs danced around it, they would occasionally realign into a straight configuration before shifting into another formation. Captivated, the passengers remained blissfully unaware, while only the crew observed the bizarre assembly as the aircraft sliced deftly through the thinning atmosphere. The objects glided with apparent intention, closing in then decelerating as if sizing up the flight path of the Strat cruiser. Captain Howard reached out to Gander Control, relaying the details of the unidentified traffic maneuvering at their altitude, only to be met with a perplexed response. Radar indicated no aircraft were nearby, and no military exercises were scheduled in their vicinity. Moreover, there were no designated air corridors traversing their path for several hundred miles. As the formation drew closer, the primary object passed just off the right side of the Strat cruiser, prompting Howard to angle his gaze to maintain sight of it. The crew estimated it was a mere mile from their aircraft, maintaining that distance for several moments in a stunning display of stability. Howard detailed in his formal statement how it radiated solidity, exhibiting traits indicative of intelligent operation. The smaller entities continued their dance around the main object, darting back and forth in movements too deliberate to attribute to mere turbulence. At one moment, two of the smaller lights executed an abrupt vertical maneuver, soaring above the primary object before plummeting behind it in a swift arc. Howard fixated on this display, underscoring the grace and fluidity with which it was performed. For an astonishing span of minutes, this peculiar formation glided alongside the Strat cruiser, the crew enveloped in a mixture of awe and shock. Notably, these objects emitted no exhaust, bore no vapor trails, and communicated no flickering signals, nor did their motion seem swayed by the cold upper air or the wake of the aircraft. Then, in an unexpected turn, the principal object tilted slightly before accelerating ahead of the Strat cruiser, moving with a velocity that caught the crew off guard. The smaller objects followed suit, increasing their distance in a synchronized blaze of motion. Howard recalled how the acceleration appeared instantaneous, void of any gradual buildup or visible thrust. The ensemble did not simply hasten, but leapt forward, as if propelled by an unseen force. With the Strat cruiser remaining on its established flight path, Howard adjusted slightly to retain his view of the enigmatic objects. They receded into the distance, shrinking momentarily before progressively decelerating yet again. This curious acceleration and deceleration unfolded repeatedly, each instance characterized by the formation's unnerving consistency, never deviating from their alignment. When Howard re-engaged Gander control, he found to his chagrin that radar remained oblivious to the extraordinary sighting. The controller inquisitively inquired whether Howard might have been observing reflections or ice crystals. Without hesitation, Howard dismissed that notion. He had traversed the Atlantic skies thousands of times, asserting that ice crystals did not drift in such coordinated configurations, and reflections held no capacity for gliding at such altitude and speed with uncanny precision. As the aircraft journeyed eastward, the smaller objects began to ascend above the cloud cover, their visibility waning. However, the primary object remained discernible, suspended at a distance, softly glowing as it seemingly reflected sunlight off its curved surface. Howard and Boyd speculated about the possibility of it being a new military reconnaissance vehicle, but nothing in known aviation engineering exhibited the agility or characteristics they were witnessing. Their encounter persisted for nearly 20 minutes, during which the objects displayed remarkable changes in speed, altitude, and orientation, all devoid of any mechanical sound. Howard observed that their movements bore a striking resemblance to magnetic repulsion, as if the objects accelerated independently of any visible propulsion. Ultimately, the formation ascended rapidly, vanishing into the sky at an angle too steep for the stratocruiser to maintain visual contact. The lights gradually faded into the upper atmosphere, leaving no discernible trace. For several long moments, the crew scanned the horizon, but the unexplained phenomena had retreated entirely. Howard directed Boyd and the navigator to meticulously document the incident. The crew produced detailed sketches capturing the shapes, sizes, and behaviors of the objects. Upon landing in London, Howard promptly filed a report with BOAC officials. The airline, taking the matter seriously, forwarded the documentation to British authorities and aviation investigators. The investigators conducted interviews with the entire crew, and their accounts matched with remarkable precision. Throughout each recounting, Howard's description remained unwavering, emphasizing the structured, solid nature of the objects and their evident intelligent control. He categorically rejected any conventional aircraft explanations. The rapid maneuvers of the smaller objects exceeded the boundaries of known engineering, and the main object's silent movement and steady pacing in relation to the stratocruiser defied all existing aviation behavior of the time. Meteorologists were brought in to assess atmospheric conditions, finding no temperature inversions or reflections that could clarify the objects moving parallel to a commercial aircraft. Astronomers concluded that no celestial phenomena could account for the observed behaviors. Military forces, both in the United Kingdom and the United States, denied any operations involving aircraft in the region during that time frame. Thus, the BOAC Stratocruiser incident was enshrined as one of the most credible multi-witness aviation sightings of the mid-20th century. Howard's impeccable reputation was well known. His crew possessed years of professional experience, devoid of any peculiar reports. Their detailed sketches and narratives crafted a coherent chronological timeline. Investigators pointed out how peculiar it was for an entire professional flight crew to experience and report an object demonstrating behavior that lay utterly outside the bounds of 1950s aviation. Howard later remarked that the object pursued them with a sense of purpose. It was not mere coincidence, nor reflection, nor imagination. They had observed something tangible. The encounter remains cataloged in aviation records, ultimately residing in the Black Vault archive. Even after decades, no conclusive explanation superseded the original accounts provided by the crew. The objects departed without leaving contrails, without disrupting communications, and without any form of communication at all. They materialized, maneuvered with deliberate intelligence, and then vanished. Above the frigid Atlantic that morning, as thousands of feet of air lay beneath the stratocruiser, and with only distant clouds ahead, a routine commercial flight served as a witness to phenomena that adhered neither to the behaviors of aircraft nor to natural occurrences. It lingered alongside the BAC crew long enough to affirm its presence unequivocally, then ascended into the atmosphere, disappearing into the heights of the sky. The encounter concluded, and the flight continued, the engines of the Stratocruiser guiding passengers toward London without incident. However, the memory of that fateful morning stayed etched in the minds of the crew for the remainder of their careers. The formation they observed that day continues to reside in documented history, a silent yet enduring puzzle traversing the expanse of the North Atlantic sky. Following that encounter, the Air Defense Command of the United States and Canada undertook vigilant monitoring of the airspace throughout September 1960. The late summer nights offered cool and steady weather across the northern tier of the continent, establishing conditions under which the long-range radar stations operated at their optimal performance. From Maine to Minnesota and from Quebec to Manitoba, operators kept watch over extensive sweeps of the airspace, utilizing early warning radars, height finder installations, and command posts linked to the NORAD Central Coordination Apparatus in Colorado Springs. That era marked a period when the Cold War maintained a constant state of alert across every console. Operators vigilantly monitored for any signs of Soviet bombers approaching over the pole, unidentified radar returns that conflicted with expected flight patterns, and anything that might threaten the continent's airspace. Most nights progressed without incident, filled with routine encounters involving scheduled airliners and training flights, alongside weather returns drifting across the screens. Yet, during several consecutive nights in September, radar technicians across various sectors began registering anomalies that eluded their understanding. The first unusual return emerged on a crisp night at a radar installation in eastern Maine. A solitary object appeared on the long-range scope, maintaining a position at approximately 90,000 feet. This altitude alone sparked immediate interest, as no aircraft in American or Canadian service operated routinely at such heights. The object held its position for nearly 20 seconds before drifting laterally with an unwavering, smooth trajectory. It neither descended, arced, nor banked. Instead, it moved horizontally at a speed too slow for a satellite, yet too rapid for a balloon. The operator monitoring the screen later recounted that the object moved as if it were gliding along invisible rails. The supervisor on duty promptly contacted the Air Defense Command Filter Center responsible for that region. It was late with few flights traversing the skies above. The command center reviewed the scheduled aircraft roster. None coincided with the altitude, none aligned with the course. The unidentified target continued its trajectory across the sector before vanishing abruptly between radar sweeps. The signal faded as cleanly as it had emerged. The next evening, in a distinct sector to the west, a similar return manifested. This time, it registered at a station located in upstate New York. The object emitted no transponder signal, displayed no altitude variation, and showed no affiliation with recognized flights. The radar technician on shift toggled through various filters, verifying it was not a mere atmospheric reflection. He tracked the entity for nearly 30 seconds. It maintained an unwavering horizontal path and then suddenly accelerated until it slipped beyond the primary beam's range. In an internal memorandum, he later noted that its speed diverged from that of any known aircraft, remained too stable for a meteor, and demonstrated instantaneous acceleration with no signs of fragmentation. By the third evening, the phenomenon escalated. Multiple stations across the northeastern and Great Lakes sectors logged comparable returns. Some appeared at astonishing altitudes while others hovered lower, around 60,000 feet, beneath the typical orbital route of satellites, yet well above the flight paths of conventional aircraft. All the returns converged on three traits: consistent movement, horizontal flight paths, and abrupt vanishing acts. NORAD's Coordination Center began to observe a gathering pattern, one that stretched over several hundred miles of airspace. The objects did not trace identical routes on successive nights, but their behavioral consistency led controllers to casually dub them as the high drifters. On one particularly well-documented night, a return arose over northern Michigan. The radar operator stationed there observed it glide southwest at a considerable altitude. He reached out to the Duluth Air Defense Sector, tasked with overseeing coverage throughout the upper Midwest. Duluth affirmed the unknown when it crossed into their radar range. The return presented a steady signal, hinting at a structured object with a significant radar cross-section. It was not a faint echo or a weather-related anomaly. A height finder radar attempted to engage with the target. The operator relayed an altitude reading soaring far above any familiar aircraft's capabilities. The return maintained its integrity for nearly an entire minute before shifting towards the west at an accelerated pace. This rate of acceleration was far beyond the reach of any interceptor aircraft stationed in the vicinity. The subsequent night, radar units at Goose Bay and Labrador captured a similar unidentified object. It traversed from north to south, crossing the Canadian sector's upper reaches. Goose Bay reached out to the Regional Command Center, which was tasked with monitoring potential incursions from polar routes. The controller inquired about the weather conditions. The skies were clear, winds mild, and no scheduled military flights were operational in that altitude range. The returning signal exhibited a steady lateral drift, subsequently rising in altitude until the beam lost contact. The controller annotated the plot with a straightforward notation: uncorrelated target, no explanation available. As more reports flooded in, NORAD initiated an examination of timeframes and radar sweeps. What baffled analysts was the consistent behavior: slow lateral movement paired with sudden acceleration and abrupt disappearances. None of the returns conformed to typical profiles of atmospheric disturbances, temperature inversions, or ground reflections. The stations generating these reports utilized different frequencies and radar systems, making a shared error improbable. A senior radar technician at a Canadian station documented in his report that the returns appeared clean and geometric, devoid of any fluctuations that might signal noise or interference. He emphasized how the objects maintained stable altitudes while traversing vast distances. Balloons would have fluctuated in height due to thermal currents. Aircraft would have left behind transponder or communication signatures. Meteors would have streaked through the sky and disappeared instantly. These entities displayed behavior suggestive of control. During one of the most remarkable nights, a radar station based in Quebec tracked an object moving southeast at an exceptionally high altitude. The controller at the console initially surmised it was a satellite, but satellites traced predictable paths and passed overhead with quickness. This particular object slowed its pace as it crossed the radar beam. It hovered for nearly 20 seconds before recommencing its motion. Satellites could not hover or decelerate within the confines of atmospheric space. He recorded his observations, noting that the object halted contrary to expected orbital trajectories. The duration of its hovering was inconsistent with satellite dynamics. Throughout the consecutive nights, no fighter interceptors were dispatched. Intercept protocols necessitated robust correlations between radar stations and clear indications of incursions threatening airspace protections. These returns drifted laterally rather than approaching on an inbound course. They did not traverse restricted zones or near strategic locations. They simply glided, accelerated, or ascended out of reach. Without a distinct threat trajectory, command centers documented the encounters but refrained from initiating intercept procedures. Nevertheless, the logs ascended through the internal reporting chain. The documents that were later declassified and archived revealed multiple sectors acknowledging unidentified returns, executing coordinated maneuvers. The objects emerged in various sectors on different evenings, yet their signatures were similar enough that analysts postulated they originated from the same source. By month's end, the pattern tapered off. The final high-altitude return reported surfaced over northern Ontario. It sustained a steady signal for a single radar sweep before vanishing. In the subsequent weeks, no further sightings were recorded. Years later, technicians who operated the consoles during those nights recalled the extraordinary steadiness of the returns. They reminisced about how the objects maintained their courses, how the signals remained pristine compared to typical atmospheric noise, and how their acceleration exceeded anything known to aviation. Some technicians posited that these enigmatic objects appeared to possess inertial control, enabling them to shift their speeds with no transitional delay. Military aircraft of that period had not operated at the altitudes recorded, while balloons could not achieve the velocities observed. Such behavior contradicted every known classification of aerial phenomena at the time. Several retired operators later remarked that they had witnessed an array of radar anomalies throughout their careers, encompassing everything from flocks of birds to temperature inversions and storm systems. None, however, bore any resemblance to the objects tracked during those September dates. Moreover, entries remained in the records marked as unidentified, spanning several nights, multiple stations, and thousands of miles of airspace. The internal memoranda conveyed a sense of quiet perplexity rather than alarm, highlighting a pattern of controlled high-altitude movement entering and exiting radar coverage, all with no discernible explanation. To this day, the NORAD Air Defense Command's multi-site tracks remain archived as one of the most incisive examples of coordinated radar returns dispersed across various sectors. No accompanying visual sightings were logged, and no pilots registered any contact. These events existed solely within the soft, persistent glow of radar screens, captivating the gaze of trained operators as they observed unknown objects traversing the continent with deliberate precision. In the frigid hours of those September nights, the skies over the northern United States and Canada lay tranquil and barren to the naked eye. Yet, within the radar consoles located in remote control centers, something navigated with calculative intention, appearing and vanishing across the expanse of the continent. The traces endure within the logs, silent and unresolved, a fragment of the long-standing record of phenomena monitored by NORAD during an era where each unidentified return bore the heavy significance of the Cold War, mingling with the intrigue of an object that seemed to defy the very characteristics of anything manufactured on our planet. Fast forward to October 2013, near San Antonio, Chile, where the Chilean Navy undertook an ordinary patrol along its central coastline. On this particular day, the Pacific rested calm beneath a delicate veil of overcast skies as a Chilean Navy patrol aircraft set forth on its standard coastal surveillance route. This maritime patrol airplane, equipped with dual engines and an infrared camera system, had departed from a naval air station to the south of Valparaiso earlier that afternoon. The mission was standard: observe fishing lanes, monitor merchant shipping routes, and provide assistance with coastal security. Nothing in the itinerary indicated that this flight would stray from typical operational protocols. The crew, consisting of a pilot, a co-pilot, and a sensor operator situated behind the cockpit, worked seamlessly. The sensor operator handled the aircraft's stabilized infrared camera, a system designed for nighttime observation, environmental assessments, and search and rescue missions. This camera could effortlessly alternate between infrared and visible spectrum modes according to the circumstances. Much of the operator's responsibility centered on identifying vessels, scanning the coastlines, and cataloging thermal data. As the flight progressed uneventfully, an unusual heat signature suddenly emerged across the ocean's surface, far ahead of the aircraft's path. Initially, the operator presumed it was a small vessel reflecting sunlight through the haze, but the thermal outline diverged from any known maritime target. The signature appeared too compact, uniform, and elevated above the waterline. Switching to the infrared channel for heightened clarity, the screen resolved swiftly, presenting a self-contained heat source gliding at a deliberate pace just above the ocean's surface. Its consistent, rounded profile emitted a steady thermal signature that failed to fluctuate as engine plumes or exhaust trails typically might. The sensor operator observed the phenomenon for several moments, striving to match its appearance with known maritime or aerial traffic. In his internal notes, he later reflected that it was neither a vessel nor a helicopter, noting it bore no resemblance to any recognized aircraft. He promptly informed the pilot, who gently tilted the aircraft to bring the object into clearer sight. The expectations among the pilots suggested they might confirm a drone or light aircraft, yet they were met instead with an absence of any visual confirmation. To the naked eye, the surroundings appeared empty. No aircraft, no bird formations, no fishing vessels. Yet the infrared system revealed the object distinctly. The pilot promptly contacted Coastal Air Traffic Control, detailing their altitude, bearing, and position, and inquiring if any aircraft were active in the vicinity. The controller scanned his displays and reported no radar readings matching the coordinates provided. No flight plan corresponded to the object's location, nor were any military exercises occurring in the area. The patrol aircraft continued its approach, with the object maintaining a near-constant speed as it glided horizontally along the coastline. It seamlessly passed through patches of low-lying clouds, re-emerging each time with the same thermal intensity. The crew repeatedly switched between infrared and visible modes, finding the object invisible under visible light, even at close proximity, while remaining perfectly distinct in infrared. The sensor operator initiated recording, capturing the infrared footage that displayed a compact, rounded object gliding steadily across the surface. The thermal glow appeared smooth and consistent, starkly divergent from the fluctuating heat patterns generated by conventional propulsion. Occasionally, the object adjusted altitude by slight increments, ascending and descending in a manner that suggested intelligent control rather than mere drifting. Approximately 2 minutes into the recording, the pilot endeavored to close the distance further. The object responded by slightly accelerating, matching the aircraft's pace without performing any erratic maneuvers or attempts to evade. It remained ahead of the patrol aircraft, seemingly aware of its presence. At one moment, the infrared display captured a brief discharge of heated material trailing from the object. The plume persisted for only a fleeting moment before dissolving into the ambient atmosphere. The pilots, relying on visual observations, discerned nothing out of the ordinary. Approximately 1 minute later, the discharge reoccurred, this time prominently captured by the infrared system. The operator remarked that the nature of the plume diverged significantly from standard exhaust emissions. It lacked the characteristic temperature gradient associated with jet engines or turbine systems. Instead, it resembled a sudden expulsion of heated gas or particulate matter devoid of a combustive structure. As the patrol aircraft continued its surveillance along the coastal expanse, visibility remained optimal. The crew maintained communication with Coastal Control, which reported an absence of any radar traces at the object's position. The controller emphasized that the radar should have registered any metallic aircraft operating at the detected altitude, yet the radar screen appeared devoid of any returns. The infrared signature of the object persisted as it approached a formation of low-lying coastal clouds. The camera maintained its tracking ability as the entity entered the fog bank, experiencing a slight dip in heat signature before regaining intensity as it emerged on the opposite side. The operator, eager to capture further details, zoomed in on the image. Despite the adjustments in altitude and angle made by the pilot to maintain pursuit, the object retained its relative distance, exhibiting neither approach nor retreat. It glided quietly over the terrain. Minutes passed before an unforeseen occurrence unfolded on the infrared display. The object seemed to cleave into 2 separate heat signatures. The division was abrupt and distinct, ruled out as a mere artifact of image distortion or cloud interference. Now, 2 entities traveled where there had once been one, both operating at the same speed and altitude while adhering to a smooth trajectory. The operator remained vigilant. The 2 distinct objects began to drift apart subtly, yet they sustained a consistent formation. Shortly thereafter, they appeared to converge once more into a singular thermal signature. The sensor operator found no logical explanation, nor did the pilots. Within the realm of known aviation or meteorological phenomena, such behavior remained unaccounted for. The patrol aircraft diligently pursued the objects for nearly 10 minutes before losing sight of them against the backdrop of the vast horizon. The entities gradually accelerated, eventually disappearing into the haze above the ocean. The infrared signature waned until it vanished entirely, leaving no visible trace to track in the light spectrum. Immediately upon their return to base, the crew compiled a report. The complete infrared recording was handed over to the Chilean aviation authorities, where analysts began their thorough frame-by-frame review of the footage. The case was assigned to a specialized investigative team, adept at handling peculiar aerial occurrences. Analysts diligently accounted for atmospheric distortion, lens reflections, and camera glare, yet none aligned with the object's anomalous behavior. Calibration logs of the infrared system presented no irregularities. Investigators meticulously analyzed the plume events, discovering through thermal assessment that the temperature gradient of the emissions did not align with typical aircraft exhaust. The dispersal pattern of the plume indicated a brief release of heated material, devoid of the density and directional qualities typically associated with mechanical propulsion. Analysts also explored the potential for drone involvement. In 2013, commercial drones lacked the operational altitude, speed, and endurance showcased in the footage. Moreover, military drones within Chilean airspace were systematically recorded, yet the airspace logs revealed no such activity in the vicinity. The object's invisibility within the visible spectrum lent further credence to the dismissal of the drone theory. Foreign aircraft were also eliminated from consideration, as no radar returns intersected with the encounter at any point. The object's conduct appeared to defy radar detection, yet it exhibited a robust thermal profile. This unusual combination held the analysts' fascination. Aircraft equipped to evade radar typically utilized materials or designs that also diminished thermal signatures. In stark contrast, this object exhibited amplified thermal visibility. The team also scrutinized the moment the entity seemingly bifurcated into two. Through meticulous frame comparisons, they verified that the secondary signature mirrored the same thermal tone and movement characteristics of the primary one. The phenomenon did not conform to heat blooming, double reflections, or any known camera artifacts. The two signatures remained distinct for several seconds before remerging. In an internal summary, one of the lead analysts stated, "Thermal duplication inconsistent with lensing or multipath suggests object capable of physical separation." After extensive review, the conclusion articulated that the object remained unidentified. Known aircraft, balloons, drones, birds, and atmospheric distortions did not replicate the actions witnessed on the footage. The report underscored the object's controlled movements, its non-reflective visual presence, and thermal consistency, marking it as a deliberate airborne structure. This case now joined a select group of Chilean military encounters involving infrared footage that defied conventional explanations. Much like the notable incident from 2014, it highlighted the striking juxtaposition of radar absence with infrared clarity, a recurring theme recognized by investigators as markedly peculiar. The preserved footage, retained in its unaltered state, circulated among aviation professionals for years thereafter, yet no consensus was ever reached. Today, the 2013 Chilean Navy thermal incident remains one of the foremost examples of an Awadia-type infrared encounter outside the United States. The object glided with meticulous control along the coastline, invisible to the eye but undeniably evident in infrared, exuding plumes that distinctly diverged from exhaust patterns. It exhibited intriguing behavior indicative of intelligent maneuvering, encompassing the pivotal moment of apparent separation into two entities. The patrol aircraft continued its mission that afternoon, with the ocean's surface maintaining its tranquil demeanor beneath the cloud cover. The object imparted no residual trace aside from the infrared documentation. The crew meticulously reported their observations, while investigators cataloged every frame with unwavering diligence. The skies above Chile returned to silence, yet the footage endures, enshrined within the Black Vault archive, a quiet testament to something unclassified, invisible to the naked eye, and shrouded in mystery. USS Theodore Roosevelt, Gimbal Case, Atlantic Ocean, United States of America, January 2015, Western Atlantic Ocean. The atmosphere above the carrier strike group was brisk and stable as FA-18 Super Hornets surged from the deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt. The carrier had been deployed off the East Coast for several weeks, engaged in preparations for an impending mission. Each day unfolded with training flights, radar calibration exercises, and air intercept drills, a rhythm well known to the pilots and weapons systems officers who had accumulated countless hours above the Atlantic. The Roosevelt had recently enhanced its radar capabilities. The newly acquired ANAP G79A SA radar system was astutely refined to identify small objects with remarkable precision. The crews dedicated extensive hours to mastering the system's behavior while carefully sifting through false returns. However, early in the training cycle, pilots began to observe contacts on their screens that diverged from the expected patterns of aircraft or meteorological phenomena. Officers from multiple squadrons observed objects gliding across their displays, accelerating instantaneously, or hovering in mid-air without losing altitude. These contacts emerged devoid of transponders, creating no radar trails typical of traditional aircraft. On the night preceding the encounter that would become known as the gimbal case, several pilots huddled over flight logs, exchanging theories about these elusive unknowns. Radar data exhibited objects soaring against the wind at lofty altitudes, steadfastly maintaining positions above the ocean. Some of these objects vanished abruptly, while others veered in manners inconsistent with established aircraft performance. Though an explanation eluded them, the pattern persisted. During one January training mission, a two-seat FA-18, piloted by a captain and accompanied by a weapons systems officer, traversed its designated airspace several miles from the carrier. The weather remained serene, with wisps of clouds meandering across the horizon. Anticipating only the presence of fellow aircraft engaged in the exercise, the crew executed a routine radar sweep, only to lock onto something extraordinary. An object manifested at high altitude, moving directly against the wind. It held a perfectly stable position, undeterred by winds of 120 knots. The crew adjusted their filters, scrutinizing for interference, and verified the radar return. The object was indeed real, airborne, and maneuvering with purposeful control. The weapons officer activated the FLIR system, shifting the camera into infrared mode. The screen transformed into a sharply contrasting display of the sky. At the center of the frame hovered a defined object, rotating with measured grace as if in a state of palpable equilibrium. Its shape appeared unfamiliar, not resembling any drone or conventional aircraft. The object, oval and flattened in contour, radiated from its internal heat signature rather than any exhaust plume. The video, later identified as gimbal, depicted the object spinning as the jet maintained pursuit. The rotation constituted one of the most striking attributes. The object pivoted around its axis without banking or altering altitude. Aircraft do not rotate in such manners. The crew instinctively recognized the peculiarity of its motion. One of the pilots radioed, noting the presence of an entire fleet of them. The radar had unveiled multiple objects further along, each behaving in a similarly unusual fashion. Spread across the sector at various distances, they all maintained positions steady against the wind. The camera followed the closest object as the aircraft closed the gap. The object sustained its altitude with no visible means of propulsion, no wings, no control surfaces, and no jet exhaust. It emitted none of the heat signatures pilots expected from aircraft in infrared. Rather, it exhibited a uniform heat pattern enveloping its entire surface. The weapons officer sought to lock the camera onto the elusive object. The system faced momentary hurdles as the object executed subtle controlled adjustments. Eventually, the lock engaged, centering the object within the frame. The rotation persisted, while the object drifted against the wind with unwavering stability. The pilot remarked via radio, observing the phenomenon. His tone conveyed neither excitement nor alarm, but a sense of measured professionalism as he acknowledged something defying conventional expectations. The object exhibited no inclination to hasten toward the jet, nor did it retreat. Instead, it maintained the distance, moving with a fluidity that left turbulence behind. The jet continued its pursuit, making slight altitude adjustments to achieve an optimal position. The camera oscillated briefly between infrared modes. In each, the object retained its distinct shape and thermal signature. It revealed no telltale flares of a jet engine. No signs of metal heating or temperature blooms appeared. Its heat source emanated uniformly. The pilot and weapons officer observed the enigmatic object as it continued to drift across their displays, ever rotating. Once more, the rotation left them perplexed. The object exhibited a capacity to pivot on a stable axis, seemingly unaffected by its trajectory. Aircraft do not rotate independently of their flight surfaces. Drones equipped with gimbaled cameras rotate only their cameras, not their entire frames. This object spun as a whole, maintaining flight without any visible adjustments. As the jet pressed forward, the object experienced a slight acceleration, not a sudden surge of speed, nor a sharp maneuver, but a gentle increase that carried it further away. The radar continued tracking additional objects within the sector, some soaring at varying altitudes. Even after the primary object gradually drifted from view, the fleet remained conspicuous on the displays. Finally, the object decelerated, rotated once more, and then vanished beyond the tracking angle. The radar return diminished until it faded entirely. The pilots returned to the carrier, prepared to file their observations. The video footage was promptly sent to intelligence officers, who diligently examined the recordings alongside analytical teams. The rotation of the object immediately captured their attention, alongside the consistent speed it maintained against the wind and the conspicuous absence of any aerodynamic features. Its behavior struck a discordant note with known capabilities of aircraft. The investigation controlled for civilian air traffic by consulting the Federal Aviation Administration, yet none were on schedule within the vicinity. The Navy subsequently probed for any friendly drones or classified programs operating in secrecy, finding none. In parallel, the Air Force provided similar findings. There were no ongoing exercises, no stealth operations, and no experimental aircrafts reported in that airspace. Weather reports from that day indicated stable wind conditions, with clear skies conducive for accurate radar readings and devoid of atmospheric distortions that could mislead infrared detection systems. The upgraded radar systems aboard the USS Roosevelt had recently been calibrated, and maintenance logs confirmed that everything was functioning normally. The footage maneuvered through several tiers of scrutiny, as each team meticulously eliminated conventional explanations for the object's appearance. It ruled out the possibilities of drones, balloons, or even birds. There was no mistaking it for a distant aircraft misidentified by optical equipment. The infrared signatures did not correlate with any known propulsion systems or aerodynamic designs. A Navy technician involved in the evaluation of the data noted that the rotation fundamentally altered the understanding of the object's capabilities, suggesting a level of controlled movement rather than mere drift caused by environmental factors. The object's capacity to remain stationary against robust winds implied a means of propulsion that eluded conventional engineering. Together with the smooth acceleration, consistent thermal readings, and lack of any aerodynamic surfaces, the evidence added layers to an already complex enigma. All signs collectively pointed toward a structured craft, evidently operating under intelligent control. Months later, the footage found its way into public forums. Years after that, the Navy officially acknowledged the authenticity of the recordings. This gimbal video joined the ranks of public archives, eventually landing in the Black Vault, where it stands as one of the clearest thermal representations of an unidentified aerial phenomenon under military observation. The essential importance of the Roosevelt case transcends the mere footage. It also resides in the context of multiple radar contacts emerging during the same set of training missions. Pilots encountered these objects not just once, but on numerous occasions across various flights. The radar returns remained stable, unwavering, and did not glitch or disperse. These objects disregarded wind patterns, maintained altitude, and traversed controlled airspace without proper identification. When the Navy publicly released its statement years down the line, it confirmed the objects as still being unidentified. Analysts conceded that the behaviors observed were inconsistent with drones, conventional aircraft, balloons, or any atmospheric anomalies. The object captured in the gimbal video stood as an unexplained phenomenon. That January, over the vast expanse of the Atlantic, the skies appeared clear and empty to anyone surveying from the carrier deck. Yet, At cruising altitude, where the air was thin and the horizon stretched unbroken across the ocean, pilots aboard the Roosevelt faced something that operated outside the bounds of established aviation principles. The object remained poised, executed rotations, matched the speed of their jet, and drifted away without generating sound or transmitting signals. It left behind merely the infrared trace caught by the flyer system, now preserved as one of the most examined UAP videos ever brought to light. The jet made its way back to the carrier, while the ocean continued its tranquil motion beneath the strike group. The mysterious object dissipated beyond the horizon, yet the record endured, a silent testament to something unclassified and unexplained navigating through military airspace with seemingly effortless control. Though the primary account has reached its conclusion, if sleep has not yet claimed you, consider following into a series of brief narratives. They recount rare encounters shared in hushed tones. One such encounter occurred during the Westall school sighting in Melbourne, Australia, in 1966, on the 6th of April. Late morning settled gently over the Melbourne suburb of Clayton South, as classes at Westall High School and the nearby Westall State School progressed into their midday routines, accompanied by light breezes drifting over the expansive grounds. Under a high overcast sky, teachers were preparing students for their recess, oblivious that shortly the once tranquil schoolyard would transform into the backdrop for one of the most widely witnessed aerial occurrences in Australian history. Around 11 o'clock a.m., a group of students engaged near the oval suddenly glanced skyward, spotting a metallic saucer-shaped object descending toward the southern edge of the school grounds. Witnesses later described the object as silver, circular, and roughly equivalent to 2 family cars. It navigated silently, gliding mere feet above the treetops in the adjacent paddock, a broad, undeveloped area commonly used as a recreational field, bordered by Cheltenham Road. The object traveled low enough for several students to witness it wobble or tilt as it traversed the sky, revealing an underside that reflected sunlight with striking clarity. In mere moments, students from both schools began pointing skyward, drawing the attention of their teachers, who stepped outside to investigate the commotion. One teacher, science instructor Andrew Greenwood, would later provide some of the most extensive testimonies recorded. He noted that initially, voices filled with excitement erupted from the students, but that jubilant tone shifted as more children laid eyes on the object. In a later account preserved within secondary archives on the Black Vault, he recounted seeing a round object that sparkled metallically as it hovered above the treetops, stating that it bore no resemblance to a balloon or conventional aircraft. It exhibited movements that defied the usual trajectories they were accustomed to witnessing. As dozens of students rushed toward the surrounding fence in pursuit of a better view, several even climbed through breaks in the wires of the fence and entered the paddock to follow the object as it descended. Testimonies from former students suggest that as many as 200 individuals witnessed the craft's movements, despite no formal attendance being recorded at the time. The object appeared to settle behind a cluster of trees on the far side of the paddock, remaining on or near the ground for approximately 20 seconds before it ascended once more. The ascent was sudden and startling. Witnesses recounted the movement as both fluid and rapid, devoid of any mechanical noise or trail of dust. The object ascended to an estimated altitude of several hundred feet and veered northwest, passing beyond the school and directing itself towards the suburb of Montreal. Mere moments later, 5 light propeller-driven planes emerged in the sky, tracing the trajectory of the mysterious craft. The nature of these aircraft remains a subject of contention. Several spectators maintained fervently that they were trainer aircraft belonging to the Royal Australian Air Force, or RAAF. However, the RAF later asserted that no aircraft had been dispatched on that day. Yet, a multitude of children, teachers, and local residents vividly recalled the aerial pursuit. Among them, a student named Joy Clark later articulated the scene with remarkable clarity in her testimonies gathered through oral history interviews, her accounts remaining consistent over decades. She described the object as silver and disc-shaped, recounting how it descended behind the trees. When it lifted off, it shot straight upward with such speed that it seemed unbelievable. Soon after, the planes appeared from behind, repeatedly circling the vicinity. As the recess bell rang shortly thereafter, hundreds of students rushed into the yard, many sprinting towards the paddock. Reports from Australian newspapers in 1966 corroborate the accounts of children who observed a circular depression in the grass where the object had alighted. Witnesses described a ring-shaped impression around 15 to 20 meters in diameter visible in the field. The grass was noted to be flattened, with evident discoloration along the edges. These impressions lingered for several days, remaining apparent even from adjacent residences. Local inhabitants also observed the occurrence. One man working near the clay pits to the south of the school reported seeing the object streaking across the sky before making a low turn above the trees. A factory worker nearby corroborated this sighting and claimed to have heard the children shouting from a distance. Calls to the Victorian police flooded in within minutes of the event. Officers arrived at the school shortly afterward, and their internal notes, summarized in period reporting and verified in archival collections, indicated that they found the children in a state of excitement, the teachers visibly unsettled, and a significant gathering surrounding the flattened grass. No formal written police report has surfaced in government archives, yet traces of the event are reflected in surviving references that reveal officers interacting with witnesses and collecting preliminary statements. By the end of the afternoon, men dressed in dark suits appeared at the school, an event repeatedly recounted in student memories. The identities of these individuals remain unclear. Several pupils speculated that they hailed from the Department of Supply, an entity that collaborated closely with the RAAF and Australia's weapons research programs at the time. Others suspected them to be investigators from the Commonwealth, tasked with looking into aircraft matters. Although no confirming records have been retrieved, the consistent nature of such recollections is striking. Teachers reflected upon being advised against publicly discussing the incident. Reports emerged that some students received similar instructions. Greenwood, the science teacher, revealed years later that a stern official warned him directly against speaking of the event, indicating that serious repercussions awaited anyone who did. Greenwood later emphasized that the warning's tone was unusually harsh. Meanwhile, aircraft traffic from Moorabbin Airport continued its flow through the area, yet none matched the movements described by witnesses. The official position of the RAAF, provided through the Department of Air, stated that there were no reports of unidentified objects that day. They offered the explanation that students may have mistaken a weather balloon for the sighted object, a rationale summarily dismissed by observers due to the witness' speed and manner of ascent, combined with the presence of multiple aircraft. An article from the Dandenong Journal published in 1966 detailed interviews with students who characterized the object as silver, round, and moving faster than any plane. This article also confirmed that the pattern of flattened grass persisted and had been photographed by local residents. One nearby resident commented that this mark endured for several days before the field was either burned or cleared by unknown parties. Within a week, the discussions surrounding the sighting rippled throughout the community. The Victorian Flying Saucer Research Society, or VFSRS, the primary civilian investigative body at the time, conducted interviews on site and collected sketches from the students. Their investigators noted remarkable consistency in the children's drawings, portraying a domed circular object with seamless edges and absent protrusions. Despite the alignment of numerous accounts, there were some discrepancies concerning the height of the object and the precise moment it settled in the paddock. However, what endured across all recollections were details of its shape, the peculiar absence of sound, and the sudden vertical climb. A small group of students claimed to have witnessed two objects instead of just one, although the majority only spoke of a singular craft. As time progressed, the incident faded from national media attention, partially overshadowed by global events and the lack of official government recognition. Yet for the community, the memory lingered on. Even decades later, reunions of former Westall students reignited interest in the occurrence. At these gatherings, individuals who had kept silent about the incident for years consistently recounted the same metallic disc, the same noiseless descent, and the same peculiar ring imprinted into the earth. Researchers in Australia combing through state and federal archives have found no government file specifically labeled Westall. Nonetheless, references to the event emerge indirectly within aviation logs, newspaper articles, and interviews conducted during the 1960s by local investigators. The absence of a formal report has evolved into a subject of inquiry itself. Certain analysts suggest that the lack of documentation reflects the conventional handling of civilian UAP incidents of that era. Others contend that a report may have existed but has simply not been preserved. Understanding the broader context of 1966 provides significant insight, as Australia was deeply enmeshed in U.S. and British defense networks at the time, playing host to tracking stations and actively participating in collaborative aerospace projects. The Department of Supply managed classified research facilities, which included the Woomera rocket range. Although the public records do not connect Westall with these initiatives, analysts observe that the airspace in the vicinity often played host to experimental operations. Nonetheless, no existing program aligned with the object's unique characteristics or movements. In more recent years, additional accounts have surfaced from former students who chose to remain silent for many years. One witness, then a girl of 13, recounted her dash to the paddock, arriving at the clearing just moments after the craft descended. She discovered the grass pressed down and surprisingly warm beneath her fingers. Her reflection, recorded later in life, captures the moment. The ground felt like it had been compressed or heated, and she noted how the circle was flawless, declaring that nothing had ever appeared like that before. To date, the Australian government has not issued further statements regarding the incident. The Royal Australian Air Force's archived documents reveal no evaluation or internal inquiry. Meteorological reports from that fateful morning noted moderate cloud cover, stable barometric pressure, and the absence of atmospheric inversions that could create optical illusions. The original paddock has long since been repurposed, leaving behind only memories, photographs, and personal accounts. The flattened grass ring observed by hundreds was neither sampled nor preserved by authorities. As it stands, the Westall case continues to be one of the most significant mass witness UAP events within the Southern Hemisphere. The uniformity of reports from both students and teachers, coupled with the absence of a traditional explanation, ensures the case remains a focal point in academic and archival research discussions. The Black Vault houses a comprehensive digital collection of newspaper archives, interviews with researchers, and secondary governmental references, making it the most extensive public repository regarding the occurrence. Following that notable April day, the schoolyard appeared to revert to its usual state. Classes continued, educators ushered students back indoors, and the morning's fervor gradually dissipated into a murmur of hushed conversations and inconsistent directives urging silence. The grass circle, which had captured the attention of many, lingered for days before it vanished. No physical remnants were retrieved, and no aircraft were identified. Only the shared memories of those who stood in the field endure, with hundreds affirming a common experience. Something metallic descended behind the trees, ascended without a sound, and left a mark that the authorities never elucidated. On the night of the 3rd of March, 1953, an icy wind swept across Selfridge Air Force Base in Michigan. Nestled just north of Detroit, Selfridge was home to interceptor squadrons tasked with safeguarding America's industrial core during the charged early years of the Cold War. The radar crews were trained to spot intruders entering from the Canadian border, while pilots remained poised for rapid deployment. However, on this particular evening, an unidentified object breached their airspace, leading to events that would become one of the more quietly unsettling cases documented by Project Blue Book. The first alert arose shortly after 9:00 p.m. Radar operators at Selfridge detected a strong unknown target approaching from the northeast. Initially, they presumed it to be a routine flight arriving from Ontario, but the speed and course did not align with any known traffic patterns. The blip progressed steadily across the radar screen before abruptly decelerating, hovering in position. Controllers found themselves perplexed. Conventional aircraft did not exhibit such behavior. Outside, ground observers reported a peculiar light in the sky. Security personnel patrolling the flight line witnessed a bright glowing object hovering soundlessly above the base's perimeter. Some described it as round with a faint halo, larger than a star yet smaller than a full moon. Unlike a navigation light, it shone steadily, luminous and eerily quiet. Within moments, the command was given: scramble an interceptor. An F-94, Starfire, the Air Force's all-weather jet fighter, roared into the night sky, its afterburner slicing through the frigid air. The pilot, Lieutenant John Williams, alongside his radar observer, surged upwards, guided by ground control toward the elusive target. As the jet approached, both men beheld the glowing object hovering several thousand feet above the base. It appeared structured, disc-shaped, emanating a steady white light. The pilot endeavored to close the distance, yet each time he altered his course, the object gracefully adjusted, maintaining its separation as though it were aware of their chase. Both radar operators and ground controllers tracked the same maneuvers as the object accelerated abruptly, then halted, darting away with maneuvering capabilities that no aircraft of the era could match. The F-94 strained its engines to their limits, but the unknown craft effortlessly outmatched it. On one occasion, the crew reported a brief flicker of their instruments, but not sufficiently to compel them to abandon the chase. Williams would later describe the experience as feeling like the object was engaging with them playfully, never exhibiting hostility, yet always remaining just out of reach. After nearly 20 minutes of pursuit, the object shot upward with astonishing rapidity, vanishing from both radar and sight within mere seconds. The chase concluded. Back at Selfridge, controllers and pilots compiled their reports. Ground observers detailed their visual accounts of the hovering object, while radar operators corroborated the anomalous readings. The interceptor crew provided both visual and instrument data, all reports maintaining consistency. A glowing, disc-shaped object responsive to pursuit, exhibiting performance far beyond that of any conventional aircraft. When Project Blue Book investigators assessed the case, they promptly recognized its significance, noting the wealth of data involved: ground radar, interceptor radar, witness testimonies from the ground, and the aircrew's observations. The event was recorded in real time, corroborated through various channels. It was not merely a single individual's narrative, but a coordinated incident documented at a major Air Force installation. Yet, as with numerous similar occurrences, the official explanations proved unfulfilling. Analysts posited that temperature inversions might have resulted in misleading radar signals, and speculated that the pilots could have confused a bright star or a planet for a dynamic entity. However, these hypotheses faltered upon examination. Temperature inversions do not generate luminous objects tracked by multiple radar systems, and stars do not evade interceptors or ascend at remarkable speeds. In private discussions, the incident was categorized as unidentified. Yet, in public discourse, it was minimized, relegated to the vast archives of Blue Book among countless other entries. For those directly involved, this dismissal was particularly disheartening. They were acutely aware of the authenticity of what they had witnessed and tracked. It was a tangible experience, remarkable and grounded in reality. The Selfridge incident's significance was magnified by its specific location and timing. In 1953, Detroit represented the epicenter of America's defense manufacturing. The city was churning out tanks, aircraft, and engines in the backdrop of the Cold War. Selfridge Air Force Base served as a guardian of that critical industrial corridor. The emergence of an unidentified object hovering in the vicinity provoked unsettling inquiries. Was it a Soviet reconnaissance vehicle, or was it an enigma of a different nature? Civilian researchers later identified this case as one of the more compelling radar visual occurrences within the Blue Book archives. NICAP drew attention to its similarities to other base incursions. Instances of radar evidence, luminous objects, calculated maneuvers, and jets that fell short in pursuit were evident. Indeed, the Selfridge episode fits into a larger narrative of unexplained aerial visitors at strategic locations such as Whartsmith, Minea, and Ellsworth. Skeptics provided a range of alternative explanations, from errant balloons to misidentified civilian aircraft, but none of these theories sufficiently accounted for the radar data or the abrupt acceleration and vertical ascent. Balloons merely drift with the wind; they do not hover and then shoot up. Civilian aircraft create predictable radar signatures; they certainly do not dart across screens with erratic bursts of speed. For the personnel who witnessed the event, the memory continued to resonate. Radar operators distinctly recalled the solid blip that defied all expectations. Ground observers held onto the memory of a silent glow suspended above the base, while the F-94 crew, professionals prepared to intercept potential Soviet bombers, found themselves humbled by an object that eluded capture. This case exemplifies the conflicting dynamics inherent to Project Blue Book. On one side, investigators acknowledged robust evidence when it presented itself: multiple witnesses, radar verification, and a military context. Conversely, public pressure demanded reassurances. Consequently, the incident was quietly categorized as unidentified, never receiving the attention it truly warranted. In contemporary times, the Selfridge AFB intruder remains a quintessential representation of a credible UFO sighting. It encompassed all the critical elements: trained witnesses, radar and visual validation, and attempted interception, and extraordinary performance. It also bore the symbolic burden of its location: an unknown craft hovering over one of America's key industrial and military hubs during the height of the Cold War. For those men who served that fateful night, it was no hallucination. Rather, it was a genuine encounter with something that defied explanation: a silent intruder capable of evading pursuit and leaving behind only questions. For us today, it persists as one of the lasting enigmas within the Blue Book files. What was the luminous visitor that appeared unexpectedly over the skies of Michigan in March 1953? A mere trick of radar and the imagination, or a fleeting glimpse of something profoundly more remarkable? In the year 1959, traces at the Yuma Proving Ground in Arizona invite further contemplation. Whatever materialized there did not scorch the earth. Instead, it seemed to impress it, as though settling into place momentarily before ascending vertically. Civilian range worker L. Hammond recounted this in 1959. The Yuma Proving Ground during the late 1950s stretched across vast expanses of unblemished desert, ventilating numerous artillery tests, flight trials, and evaluations conducted under some of the most stable atmospheric conditions found. In the United States, the terrain lay bare and parched, interrupted solely by patches of shrubbery and the faint outlines of access roads winding towards remote testing areas. It was in one such secluded range, far removed from public highways and nearly unseen by civilians, that unusual traces were discovered on a quiet September evening in 1959. These traces neither bore signs of scorching nor appeared weathered, yet they differed markedly from any remnants left behind by military equipment. The individual who stumbled upon them, a civilian contractor named Leonard Hammond, had journeyed out the following morning to retrieve equipment markers after a routine firing test. Departing before dawn, he navigated a government-issued jeep down a narrow gravel path towards an area that had seen no vehicular activity since the day prior. Upon arrival, the sun had risen above the Gila Mountains, casting elongated shadows across the arid desert floor. In those shadows, Hammond detected an anomaly. A circular indentation impressed into the ground, nearly perfect in symmetry, with the center slightly depressed compared to the perimeter. He halted the jeep and approached it on foot. The depression measured approximately 13 feet across, exhibiting a shallow but uniform outer ring surrounding a deeper central basin. The soil within the circle bore no signs of fire. Rather, it was compacted, as though a significant weight had rested upon it without generating heat. Along the edges, Hammond discerned subtle impressions, not tire tracks or skids, but minute indentations forming a triangular pattern, as if supports had temporarily borne weight. Initially, he considered that some type of testing apparatus might have been inadvertently left behind or deployed without prior indication. However, the sector had not been active overnight, and access was strictly restricted. There were no tire tracks entering or departing from the site. The surface remained untouched, save for the circle itself. Hammond moved outward in expanding loops, but found no additional markings, footprints, tire ruts, or debris. He contacted the range office to report his findings, prompting the dispatch of 2 technicians to investigate further. By the time the technicians arrived, the sun had ascended sufficiently to unveil myriad details previously obscured. The earth within the circular depression exhibited a markedly different hue, appearing lighter and more arid compared to the unblemished surrounding terrain. One of the technicians, while pressing the edge of his boot against the strange formation, observed that it possessed an unusual firmness, reminiscent of soil compacted by a mechanical tamper. Yet, the military operations conducted at Yuma did not employ any equipment capable of creating impressions of such distinct shape or dimension. A senior officer on duty swiftly mandated the area to be cordoned off. Photographs were meticulously captured, measurements taken with precision, and soil samples collected meticulously within paper envelopes, each distinctly marked with the appropriate time, date, and grid location. The initial military documentation, inscribed in TUR language, classified the disturbance as a circular ground anomaly characterized by uniform compaction, devoid of tracks, and lacking any notable thermal signatures. An explanation eluded them. Given Yuma's remote location, civilian access was severely limited. The notion that someone could have infiltrated the testing grounds in the hours of darkness without leaving behind any tracks or vehicular traces was considered inconceivable at that time. Hammond later articulated in his deposition to NICAP that the soil surrounding the circle remained undisturbed for many yards in every direction. The desert crust, once disrupted, typically displayed visible signs for days. However, outside the confines of the circle, the terrain remained intact. News of the peculiar trace eventually reached a former Air Force officer residing in Phoenix, who was also serving as a field correspondent for NICAP in Arizona. Following NICAP's standard procedure, local correspondents were obliged to secure documentation whenever feasible prior to escalating the issue to headquarters. He reached out to Hammond within a month after the initial discovery, conducted an interview, and obtained copies of the photographs. Subsequently, he traveled to the site himself. Although the circle had somewhat eroded due to the wind in the weeks that followed, its outline remained discernible, with the compacted soil within feeling notably firmer than the adjacent earth. He documented every detail and submitted the findings to NICAP's central office, alongside a preliminary classification of C2 physical trace unexplained. Analysts at NICAP initiated their assessment by verifying the authenticity of all submitted documentation. Their standard protocol required meticulous corroboration of witness accounts against military records. The range logs substantiated that no equipment, vehicles, or nighttime operations had occurred in that sector between Hammond's final patrol the previous afternoon and his return the following morning. The log entries were unequivocally clear and comprehensive, reflecting strict access restrictions whereby no civilian or unauthorized individual could have entered the area without due record. The absence of vehicular tracks lent credence to this assertion. NCAP then proceeded to evaluate the material characteristics of the trace. While the dimensions, shape, and compaction patterns of the circle were indeed unusual, they were not entirely unprecedented. NCAP cross-referenced similar cases from its archives, focusing particularly on instances documented in the southwestern United States, where circular impressions devoid of burn marks had been reported alongside witness accounts of objects hovering or descending. The distribution of compaction within the circle indicated an aberrant weight distribution, diverging from the expected norms of aircraft landing gear or recognized military apparatus. Soil sample analyses conducted at a nearby laboratory yielded data indicating both dehydration and compaction, yet revealing no chemical alteration. This analysis was included verbatim in the NICAP file. One analyst noted in the margins that the findings were consistent with downward force rather than thermal effects or mechanical scraping. The reliability of witness accounts was subsequently assessed. Hammond, lacking any history of reporting peculiar phenomena, worked in a technical capacity and provided a straightforward, unembellished narrative. The technicians who accompanied him to the site corroborated his description, each documenting the uniformity of the depression and the clear absence of any disturbance in the surrounding area. The senior officer's report adhered to standard protocol, maintaining an impartial tone without offering interpretations. NICAP also undertook an environmental review, examining weather records for Yuma from that night, which indicated a complete absence of storms, lightning, high winds, or seismic activity. The possibility of the depression being the result of collapsing soil or natural subsidence was dismissed given the circle's distinct shape and the rigidity of the compacted soil. Likewise, animal activity was ruled out since no wildlife could produce geometric impressions of such scale and uniformity. In adherence to NICAP's procedures, analysts reconstructed a timeline based solely on verifiable data. The sector was confirmed undisturbed by late afternoon, no personnel were present overnight, and the circle manifested by morning. The lack of entry tracks suggested that whatever caused the phenomenon descended vertically, rather than traverse the ground. The pattern of uniform compaction indicated that the object had rested for only a brief moment. The absence of thermal signatures implied it did not utilize combustion processes or jet exhaust. Internal communications within NICAP revealed that analysts were drawn to the trace's pristine nature. Many trace cases often suffered contamination from foot traffic or environmental degradation prior to investigator arrival. However, the desert conditions in this instance preserved the circle with remarkable clarity. The ring pattern, indentations, and variations in soil were well defined when captured in photographs. One NICAP staff member remarked on the ideal preservation, describing it as rare. The organization then proceeded to draw comparisons between the Yuma trace and other incidents involving physical evidence. Some cases contained charred vegetation, while others were characterized solely by soil compression. The situation at Yuma fell into the latter category. Analysts noted that the compaction profile bore resemblance to two prior documented instances, one from Utah in 1953 and another from New Mexico in 1957, both of which involved circular impressions, where witnesses claimed to have seen luminous objects descending briefly before accelerating skyward. Though NICAP refrained from drawing definitive conclusions, the similarities were duly recorded within the case file. The subsequent phase involved classification, wherein NICAP assigned a reliability rating contingent upon several factors: the types of witnesses, the veracity of physical evidence, environmental steadiness, and the completeness of documented observations. Armed with a suite of consistent reports, rigorous laboratory analyses, military documentation, and preserved photographic evidence, the file on Yuma achieved a status of high reliability. The organization underscored that the essence of the case remained strictly physical in nature. There were neither lights nor sounds nor any visual sightings. Only the quantifiable traces left behind spoke of what had transpired. NICAP's summary articulated the findings: a circular depression in the ground within a secured military area, devoid of access for personnel or vehicles. The soil demonstrated uniform compaction, accompanied by triangular indentations at the periphery. Notably, there was a total absence of heat and no conventional rationale to account for the phenomenon. Years later, the Yuma trace endures as one of NICAP's most lucid cases, categorized as CE2, calm, unembellished, and grounded in the physical evidence meticulously collected prior to any degradation of the site. Its significance rests not upon dramatic narrations, but rather in the void of mundane explanations. Something pressed into the desert floor during a night devoid of activity, leaving behind a pristine imprint before making a silent departure without any tracks, heat signatures, or debris. Though the relentless desert wind gradually softened the edges of the circle, the photographs and soil samples persist in the precise condition as archived by NICAP. They depict a straightforward impression in the earth, a fleeting moment of contact that remains shrouded in mystery, preserved solely because Hammond recognized what the breaking dawn unveiled. The Saint. Lawrence Corridor object observed in 1989 in Quebec, Canada, serves as an archival reference, catalogued within the NORAD Eastern Air Defense Surveillance Log under number 8911 STLC, The Saint. Lawrence River meanders broadly through Quebec, extending its course from the Atlantic into the heartlands toward the Great Lakes. Nestled along its corridor are dense tracts of forest, tranquil stretches of farmland, and the clustered lights of diminutive towns by the riverside. Above this landscape, radar systems operated by both civil and military stations vigilantly monitor a major air route that links Canada's eastern regions with the broader continent. During the late 1980s, NORAD conducted continuous surveillance over the corridor, recognizing it as a crucial pathway connecting the Atlantic to several vital military installations situated further inland. Most nights unfolded with nothing unusual: routine civil flights, weather systems drifting in from the ocean, and sporadic training maneuvers conducted by Canadian Forces aircraft. However, amidst one of those nights in 1989, controllers overseeing the eastern radar grid detected a return maneuvering into the monitored corridor from the distant northeast. At first, the signal bore the hallmarks of a feeble primary echo, the kind that intermittently appears due to distant meteorological interference, but with the next radar sweep, the return sharpened. It now presented a structured radar cross-section indicative of an airborne object, distinctly different from atmospheric clutter. The object's altitude placed it within a range above typical weather returns, yet below the cruising levels of commercial aircraft, engendering an early realization that the signal warranted closer scrutiny. Civil air traffic controllers in Montreal cross-checked their databases in vain. No transponder codes populated the area corresponding to the return's location. All scheduled arrivals and departures had been accounted for, and there were no military flights registered with low-altitude maritime transit plans that coincided with the heading observed. The absence of identifiable aircraft rendered the radar return a candidate for NORAD screening. The signal was subsequently relayed to the NORAD Eastern Air Defense Sector, where technicians commenced the process of correlating the object with the long-range radar network. Conditions that evening were conducive. The atmosphere remained clear, with stable temperature gradients that hindered the formation of radar ducting. Meteorological observations from Environment Canada reaffirmed that pressure systems exhibited normal behavior, lacking inversions capable of generating persistent false targets. The lack of these distortions bolstered the argument that the radar was registering something with a physical presence. Analysts at NORAD meticulously scrutinized the return. Its motion departed from the erratic drift typical of windborne objects, charting instead a smooth, purposeful course that bisected the prevailing winds from the northwest. The consistency of the radar signal echoed that of a solid structure. The cross-section exhibited minimal variation, suggesting that whatever the object was, it maintained both orientation and reflectivity with negligible fluctuation. Radar operators fine-tuned the gain and compared the strength of the signal across multiple sweeps. Each cycle yielded a return that remained clean, coherent, and devoid of scatter. During its initial traversal, the object's speed exhibited slight but precise fluctuations, moving steadily, decelerating marginally, then accelerating once more. Although these variations were not extreme, they were pronounced enough to eliminate passive drift attributable to weather phenomena. This return bore no resemblance to any known patterns associated with civilian aircraft, military jets, helicopters, or balloons. The altitude exceeded that of a helicopter, yet remained below typical ranges for long-distance military transit flights. Its speed diverged from conventional aircraft profiles, complicating any attempts at categorization. The object continued its journey deeper into the corridor. Civil radar sites in the vicinity, although primarily configured for transponder tracking, recorded intermittent primary returns that aligned with the position indicated by the long-range radar. This alignment provided critical cross-system verification, a fundamental element in NORAD's evaluation protocol. The object existed within physical space, captured across multiple sensors. As the return progressed along its path, controllers endeavored to reach out to any aircraft that may have been in the area. Silence prevailed, no responses emerged, no flight crews reported observing any other nearby traffic. The skies above the river persisted in their darkened stillness, punctuated only by the scattered lights along the coast and the distant shimmering reflections upon the water's surface. Military operators stationed at the regional NORAD post meticulously scrutinized the radar geometry. The return exhibited characteristics that transcended the typical signatures associated with aircraft. Maintaining a low yet stable altitude and displaying a deliberate speed, the radar return suggested a compact metallic object. Its capacity to resist alignment with prevailing winds implied the presence of active control or propulsion. Canadian Forces Air Command, based in North Bay, conducted a thorough review of the radar feed, adhering to their operational protocols, which mandated identification of any unidentified object traversing controlled or strategic airspace. Given that the St. Lawrence River corridor intertwines several military installations with civilian transit routes, the emergence of an unidentified aircraft was treated with utmost seriousness. The unidentified track warranted further examination. However, it did not yet necessitate a scramble. No signs of hostility were evident. The object seemed content to proceed along its current trajectory, exhibiting no erratic movements. As the unidentified object ventured deeper into the corridor, radar operators observed a peculiar moment when the object appeared to momentarily stall. For several sweeps, it sustained its altitude and radar cross-section without deviation. Such hovering behavior is generally uncommon among fixed-wing aircraft, typically necessitating rotary wing mechanics or atypical propulsion systems. Nevertheless, the altitude remained beyond the operational range of most helicopter models, while the radar cross-section did not conform to that of any known rotary wing craft. This momentary pause was fleeting, as the object soon resumed its previous heading. Throughout this incident, the radar systems performed flawlessly. Calibration logs recorded no errors, fluctuations in power, or frequency anomalies. Technicians executed rapid diagnostic assessments to eliminate the possibility of internal reflections or side lobe detections. All systems verified normal operational status. The radar chain encountered no operational deficiencies. Subsequent evaluations of weather data from the National Weather Service and satellite imagery yielded no temperature inversion layers conducive to false radar returns. Upper air soundings from the region indicated a stable atmospheric stratification. The absence of any inversion signified that the radar was not picking up distant ground reflections, a frequent cause of false positive signals during specific weather conditions. At one stage, a civilian flight transiting the area reported a fleeting glint far beneath their altitude, described as a bright flash that momentarily illuminated before vanishing. While the cockpit crew did not submit a formal report, a brief note emerged in internal communications between air traffic controllers once they were notified of NORAD tracking an unidentified object. The glint could not be substantiated. However, its timing coincided with the radar's tracking of the unknown object. No further visual confirmations were documented. The expansive, dark stretches of the St. Lawrence region and the object's low altitude in relation to established commercial flight paths rendered it challenging for ground observers to detect. Nonetheless, the persistent presence of radar provided the essential basis for NORAD's assessment. As the unidentified object approached the corridor's midpoint, it executed a slight course adjustment, veering southward with a smooth and intentional maneuver. The radar cross-section exhibited negligible alteration during this turn, indicating the object maintained controlled movement stability while executing directional shifts without losing altitude or radar reflectivity. Canadian Forces personnel deliberated over plausible explanations. No survey balloons had been deployed in that vicinity. Tests, flights, or experimental aircraft were not scheduled. No foreign military aircraft had been detected within Canadian airspace, and domestic aircraft had filed no emergency transponder off procedures, which typically demand immediate communication with air traffic controllers. The unidentified object operated with apparent disregard for both civil and military monitoring systems. Following nearly 20 minutes of observation, the radar return began to drift toward the southern boundary of the monitored corridor. The signal gradually weakened, not through a sudden cessation, but rather via a steady decline in reflectivity. This pattern suggested either an increase in distance or a change in the object's angle relative to the radar. The return diminished progressively until it fell out of the radar's detection range. No additional returns were registered, and the object did not re-enter the monitored zone for the remainder of the night. In the aftermath of this event, NORAD initiated a comprehensive technical review. Analysts reconstructed the track using frame-by-frame radar data, confirming the presence of a structured airborne body exhibiting steady control, slight variations in speed, a brief hovering period, and a smooth change in heading. Engineers analyzed the radar's precision frequency measurements, finding no anomalies. Atmospheric modeling effectively ruled out false targets. Historical comparisons yielded no closely aligned cases within that region. Although certain patterns from the northern tier during the 1970s bore faint resemblances in behavior, Canadian air defense specialists included this particular occurrence in their internal surveillance record. The nature of the object's behavior failed to align with known aircraft signatures, and neither national nor foreign authorities reported any flights that might account for the radar track. The final classification adhered to the customary NORAD terminology for these situations. The track departed coverage without any correlation to known aircraft or atmospheric phenomena, duly logged for historical reference. The Lawrence Corridor object attracted significantly less scrutiny compared to other, more sensational incidents documented by NORAD. It settled quietly into the annals as an illustrative instance of how structured aerial entities can traverse heavily monitored airspace without any form of identification. The dependability of the radar readings, coupled with the clear atmospheric conditions and the methodical movements of the object, allowed it to secure a place in the roster of events that elude conventional categorization. In the subsequent years, the corridor retained its activity with recurring air traffic, yet this particular case yielded no follow-up detections or recurring patterns. Nonetheless, the object's profile, marked by its controlled trajectory, consistent altitude, resistance to prevailing winds, and coherent radar cross-section, ensured its status in the NORAD surveillance archives as an unresolved enigma. This categorization marked a technical event documented with meticulousness, devoid of conjecture. It pertained to the White Sands Missile Range anomaly, New Mexico, in the year 1957, specifically on May 15th. As the first light of morning began to spread across the Tolosa Basin, teams at White Sands Missile Range prepared for a typical sequence of tracking and calibration tests. By the mid-1950s, the range was functioning at full capacity. Its extensive network of optical stations, telemetry receivers, synthetites, and radar arrays constituted one of the most highly instrumented weapons testing corridors globally. Almost every square mile of its restricted airspace was under the vigilant oversight of the United States Army, Holloman Air Force Base, or the Federal Aviation Administration. The day's agenda called for a telemetry-equipped test missile, nothing more. However, shortly after 9 o'clock in the morning, an unexpected entry appeared in the log of Optical Station Delta. While conducting routine camera calibration sweeps, a technician monitoring the southern horizon discerned a shape drifting into view. Initially, he suspected it to be a stray research balloon, a common sight around White Sands during atmospheric sampling runs, but the object maintained its structure too meticulously to be easily dismissed. Through the high-magnification Econia tracking scope, it presented as a sharply defined ellipse, luminous rather than reflective, making its way west to east at a stable altitude. The station's initial entry, later archived as part of the White Sands Optical Tracking Report, provided an exact description. Object elliptical, consistent luminance, estimated altitude ranging from 30,000 to 40,000 feet, bearing steady with motion control. The technician promptly sought confirmation from Station 14, and within moments, a second optical team identified the same object crossing the pristine New Mexico sky. As additional stations lined up their cameras, range control was notified. Not a single aircraft was scheduled for that sector. No balloons had been deployed, nor had any special operations received clearance through Holloman Air Force Base. What was typically an airspace rife, with telemetry and instrumentation, now played host to a silent, pre-scheduled intruder. Upon the object's incursion into the range's central corridor, crews initiated multi-angle tracking. Observed from disparate baselines, it exhibited the same elongated metallic geometry, sharply defined, devoid of wings, rotors, or tail structures. The absence of rotation drew immediate attention. Most balloons tend to tumble or drift erratically, yet this object exhibited a rigid orientation with mechanical precision. An optical analyst seasoned in missile range operations later provided a comprehensive statement, now preserved in the optical log supplement. His account conveyed the moment with clarity. Tracking aircraft, test drones, and every variant of balloons ever deployed had been his domain, yet none shared characteristics with this entity. It flew in a straight line, free of drift, rotation, or any visible propulsion. It appeared manufactured, smooth, bright, and steady. He anticipated finding a seam, shadow, or wobble that might betray its true nature, but nothing ever changed. A second technician from Station Bravo articulated his observations, equally meticulous. The object moved as if guided, broken silence accompanied by neither a sound nor a trail, nor any discernible shift in pitch or yaw. The radiance wasn't a product of glare. It emanated evenly across the surface as if the object itself radiated light. That aspect particularly struck him, as such uniform luminosity typically implies active emission rather than mere reflection. Range Commander Captain Robert Keller promptly ordered a radar correlation. The Synthety radar at Station 14 secured a return, intermittent yet distinctly structured. The radar supervisor's summary, in Instrument Log WSMR 1457, documented the initial return as strong, diminishing intermittently, identified as possibly low radar cross-section object exhibiting angle-dependent reflectivity. This terminology aligned with no recognized aircraft signature. Balloons generally yield weak, erratic returns, yet this object produced a stable signature that only weakened during angle changes. Weather reports from the United States Weather Bureau in El Paso confirmed ideal atmospheric clarity, visibility extending beyond 40 miles, standard temperature gradients, and no inversion layers or thermal reflections capable of simulating UFO. Structured tracked object residing at 30,000 feet. The FAA Albuquerque Center corroborated that no civil aircraft had filed within the restricted corridor. As tracking data accumulated, the object traversed Overhead Launch Area 3. Film cameras documented more than 300 frames from several angles. Specialists analyzing the film subsequently revealed the absence of balloon seams, suspension lines, or aerodynamic surfaces. In numerous frames, the object's leading edge appeared noticeably sharper than the trailing edge, indicating a fixed orientation concerning its direction of travel. That detail alone stood in stark contrast to expected balloon behavior. Velocity calculations derived from triangulated optical data estimated speeds ranging from 480 to 520 miles per hour, excessive for any freely floating object in the upper atmosphere, yet remarkably smooth, suggesting no influence from turbulence-driven debris. The speed maintained an unwavering rhythm within a tight spectrum, an attribute rarely observed in natural entities. As a result, the range control team halted all test launches. The potential breach of airspace by an unidentified aircraft necessitated a complete cessation of firing operations. Communication with Hollowman AFB was reinitiated, but the response remained consistent. There would be no test flights, no transits, and certainly no high-altitude balloons. The United States Army Ballistic Missile Agency relayed that there had been no launches originating from adjacent facilities. Radar at Instrumentation Site 6 endeavored to secure continuous lock, but faced the same inconsistent reflectivity documented previously. This pointed toward evidence of a physical craft, albeit one whose configuration did not resemble any known aircraft. As the object continued its trajectory eastward, observers reported no variation in brightness despite the sun's changing position. The light emission remained constant, a further anomaly. Typically, reflective objects exhibit variations in brightness as viewing angles adjust. In this case, however, it did not. At approximately 9:12 a.m., the craft executed its singular unconventional maneuver. Rather than exiting the range along a straight vector, it initiated a rapid ascent, recorded by two stations at a rate exceeding 12,200 feet per second. Subsequent calculations later confirmed that the altitude increased by approximately 20,000 feet in under 15 seconds. No sonic boom erupted, no contrail manifested, and no heat signature emerged on the infrared sensors. Such a maneuver, theoretically, would have produced measurable atmospheric turbulence. Yet, optical footage captured none. A memo from Station Delta, included in Range Chronology File 57R, accurately encapsulated the ascent. The object performed a near-vertical climb without exhibiting any rotational instability, an ascent rate surpassing known aircraft capabilities. Lack of an acoustic signature was also noted. After momentarily stabilizing at high altitude, the object proceeded eastward until visual contact was ultimately lost. The film canisters underwent timely custody transfer, meticulously logged through the White Sands Photographic Analysis Laboratory. Frame-by-frame enhancements revealed a smooth, elliptical form with a consistent geometry that remained true across all captured angles. Various testing protocols, including lens flare assessments, emulsion examinations, and shutter synchronization analyses, verified the authenticity of the images on the original negatives, effectively dismissing the possibility of camera artifacts. A complete technical package was dispatched to the United States Army Ballistic Research Laboratories at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Their appraisal, meticulously preserved in Document Packet W, SMR-57L, concluded unequivocally that the object bore no resemblance to any known United States missile, aircraft, test drone, or atmospheric research apparatus. The laboratory specifically highlighted that the uniform luminance across the surface could not be attributed to solar reflection under the observed angles. Independent analysts also scrutinized the range diagnostics. Radar calibration logs indicated no malfunctions. Telemetry receivers captured no errant signals. Synethalite timing systems operated well within tolerances. Weather data remained stable, leaving no natural explanation viable. Later that summer, HoloMan AFB circulated reports detailing analogous luminous ellipses observed at high altitudes. Though discrepancies existed in their specifics, the sightings bore sufficient similarities to merit internal cross-referencing. None precisely matched the flight path or behavioral patterns of the object from May 15th, but collectively, the incidents proposed the possibility of a recurring phenomenon. By late 1957, all documentation related to the event found refuge under Range Incident Report 57-221, accompanied by an administrative summary articulating that an unidentified aerial object had traversed restricted airspace. Multiple confirmations via optical and radar mechanisms detailed characteristics inconsistent with known vehicles. For decades, the case quietly resided in restricted archives. When ultimately declassified and accessible to public domains, the documentation unveiled a staggering volume of technical measurements outlining angular coordinates, lens focal lengths, exposure timings, radar ranges, atmospheric profiles, and operator statements. Such a comprehensive suite of instrumentation is a rarity among mid-century sightings. The significance of White Sands lies in its unique environment, designed expressly to measure, verify, detect, and document comprehensively. It aimed to eradicate ambiguity. Yet a structured, luminous, high-altitude object traversed its bounds, entirely unidentifiable, devoid of a propulsion signature or recognizable aerodynamic behavior, leaving in its wake merely film, records, and radar traces. No classified aircraft could be matched against the object. No foreign intrusion was ever detected. No atmospheric event could credibly account for its stability, velocity, or rapid climb rate. It was not a mere trick of light nor an equipment anomaly. The measurements remain irrefutable. Following the incident, standard test operations resumed, with technicians returning to calibration workflows. The desert, once more, fell into its usual tranquil state, yet the record left in its wake lingers, thorough and unresolved. The logs maintain their clarity. The film preserves the evidence of what was encountered. An object traversed one of the most scrutinized segments of American airspace, recorded by multiple stations, tracked in broad daylight, stabilized in its flight, and vanished without a trace. Nothing in the available documentation reconciles its origin. Nothing in the subsequent decades has paralleled its behavior. The White Sands anomaly stands as clear as the data suggests. A tangible, structured object entered, traversed, and exited restricted military airspace through controlled motion without proper identification. This has been another exploration into the realms of the unexplained, accompanied by aspirations for greater transparency. Be sure to tap like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more fresh accounts of alien and UFO encounters shared here daily.